people that are going to go there.
I'm sure there would be people that would just be out there trying to do that, even though they have like one of those cameras that are extended past their arm. Those 360 cameras trying to record it as a vlog. Yeah, surfing in a tsunami.
Yeah, I'm sure that's gonna happen.
Until they almost die. Anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, so today we're going to start by talking about just like filmmaking starter equipment. And this is just for people who don't really know where to begin, what to get first, those kinds of things. And we'll delve deeper into each piece of equipment at a different point in the semester. But this is just a general overview for people who don't know where to begin or what even to look into for like a starter filmmaker kit. And of course, this is just based on different people's opinions. I have my own, which I'll go over as well, but the order of which you buy things and what you find most important might be different compared to what other people find more important and vice versa.
Yeah, everyone was mentioning like, in my opinion, the entire time, because there's going to be those people that are like, oh, you told me to buy this and it sucks for me or whatever. So everything, grain of salt, do your research. Everything is different too. Also, like what you want to do with it. There's that too.
Yeah.
Like he specified, one of the things that he said was like, in Maddie's video, he was like, oh, I recommend I recommend you get a drone before you get lights, because lights are cheap to rent. And I was like, what? I mean, and I was like, it really depends on what you want out of your equipment and what you're doing.
Yeah, because he shoots a lot of like adventure type stuff. So having a drone is more important to him because he's outside rather than having lights. But for like filmmaking, especially if you know you're going to do interiors or at all, or you have ideas for that type of thing, you would want to get lights. Like one of your early on pieces of equipment would be lights.
But because he does a lot of stock footage, his case is completely different.
Well, he records the stock footage, but yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the first thing that a lot of people say you should start with, of course, is the camera. The camera is going to be the starting point, the main thing, the brain of the whole video production. What you're going to be, you're going to be getting these accessories that go to this camera. The lenses are going to have to do with what the camera is, things like that. So camera is the first thing that you might want to look into when trying to figure out what you're going to get for your starting filmmaking kit. So, camera, of course, is one of the first things. And then lenses would be next. Lenses is like, that's going to be something that goes with the camera. If you get a camera that doesn't have interchangeable lenses, that's something, but those aren't really used as much for filmmaking, like short films and other narrative things, because we want to be able to adjust the focal length and the bokeh and these other elements that we want to be able to change around and have control over more than you can if you have a camera that doesn't have any interchangeable lenses. So after you get your camera, which is something else you want to look into when trying to get your camera, of course, is what kind of lenses can go with that, so that you can see if that's in your budget range as well. Because once you get those lenses, you need to make sure that they're compatible with your camera, or that you have thought about having to get an adapter or something that can make those lenses work with the camera you bought. So those are the first two things. I would say lights for number 3. I think lights are really important, especially if you're just starting out filmmaking. You want to be able to start working with lights right off the bat and see how it affects the image, how it affects what you can do. You want to see hard light versus soft light. You want to see all these different things that you can do and how you can make the image quality look better. So my third piece of equipment would be lights. And looking into that, you would have to figure out what kind of lights you might want. There's LED lights, there's soft boxes that could be LEDs, stuff like that, but there'll be different variations on soft boxes alone. There'll be different variations on LED lights and what they can do, and tungsten lights and other things that you might want to look into to see what you can get. For a starter kit, I would recommend probably LED lights because they're the most versatile, but you'd have to look into if they can give off good quality, or like if they're within your budget, like get whatever's in the means of your budget, but get as high of quality within your budget as you can get by doing a little research. And we'll delve into lights a lot further into the semester to talk more in depth about what to look for when buying a light. The next thing I would say, maybe this either before or after lights, I would say is a monitor. You want to be able to see what you're shooting. Some cameras have the monitor attached to the body. Others, like the more professional ones, you have to buy an external monitor, or it might come in a kit that you buy all together. Either way, if you don't have a monitor, get one. You need to see what you're shooting. You need to see what it looks like. So I would say maybe even this before lenses. Just depends on if your camera has one or not. Next, you want to think about audio, and you want to think about what kind of audio you're trying to do. If you, depending on what you're shooting, since we're talking about filmmaking and stuff like that in this, I would say a shotgun mic would be the way to go for your first mic. And then thinking about lavalier mics or lapel mics after that. So the ones on the right, the shotgun mic, you wanted to look into that, see what kind you want, see what's in your affordable range, and then look into getting a mic. Then for the mic, because you're getting a shotgun mic, I would look into getting a boom pole. Boom pole is where you attach the mic, and that way you can have somebody, hopefully you have an audio person that's on set that can hold the boom mic and get it as close to the actors as possible to get the best audio. Then you need some stabilization for your camera. You don't want to do everything handheld because then you'll have all that shake, and most of the time we don't want that. We want it to be pretty smooth. And so the next thing to look into is a stand, a tripod, monopod at least, but I would say get a tripod. That way you have good ability to do some pans. You want to get a fluid head tripod. That way you can do panning and you can do tilting and it will look very smooth and it won't be jerky or hard to do. So you want to look into that. Again, we'll look deeper into these things later, as in like what to look for and what are some good brands. This is just like a starting point. And then light stands, you need that for your lights. This, I would probably buy right after I buy lights, honestly. You can't really do anything with lights if you don't have the stands to put them on. I just put it later on in the order. And then to go with lighting, this 5-in-1 reflector, it's the easiest thing to start out with, to have different lighting abilities to reflect off of this thing in different colors, or to use the middle piece, which would be the diffusion. It's just a really simple tool that's pretty cheap and easy to carry around. And so that would be my next thing that I would get if I was getting a starting kit. Other things to think about, you got to get a slate. The slate's that clapper board that you see where you start out the clips. You want to make sure that when you're getting into editing or you send it off to an editor, they know which clips are which. And doing a slate is the way to do that, so that you can make sure that you have what take and what scene it is for each take you do. And then you want to get a camera bag to be able to put everything in. So you want to look into these different camera bags and see what kind of, which one you need, how big you need, and if it's going to break after use for a while or if it's very durable. And then another thing, if you're going to be editing the stuff yourself, you need to make sure that you can get a computer that's able to handle editing. It can be a laptop. Laptops are starting to be able to edit. If you're doing very heavy work or if you're doing visual effects, then you're going to need a desktop computer, either a custom-made PC or one of the newer models of an iMac or a what is it called, like a Mac Mini or whatever they're called, where you have a desktop Mac. You're going to need to get something like that to do some heavier work. But if you're just doing general starting out YouTube videos, things like that, then a laptop should be fine and should suffice for what you need. Also, when you're getting your camera, you want to make sure that you know what all is needed to go with that camera. Cameras are going to need to have camera batteries, and you want to have spare batteries and a charger when you are on set using that, because most of the time when you're on set all day, one camera battery is not going to suffice. It's going to run out of juice and you're going to need to change that battery some point in the day. And you want to be able to charge up the battery while the other one is being used, so you always have one that's able to be used, so you never run out of batteries. So maybe like a spare or 2 batteries, but you want to see how much those batteries are and make sure you factor that into your price for the camera as well. So that is mine. My main little starter kit. It's not much, and especially once you start getting more into it, you start looking into seeing what else you need, what could go with these things, how you could expand on them. Getting a field recorder would be next, I would say, which would be like a separate audio recorder, because you can record audio straight into the camera, but if you're having somebody that's holding that boom mic, they need to carry around a separate audio recorder to record it, so they can hold that into like their, like attach it to their belt, or they can have it somewhere near them so that they can move around with it and it's more maneuverable. If the field record, if the mic is attached to the camera, then it very much lessens the amount of space that the audio person can go to get away from the camera, and it causes some problems. So I would recommend getting a separate audio recorder, field recorder, to be able to handle the mic and have the audio person with that for your starting kit. Now, of course, if you're working with other people that have that stuff, then you wouldn't need it, which is why, you know, this is all subjective of what you think you will need, which is why most people say just start with a camera, because you might be able to find somebody who knows how to do sound that already has their own equipment, and they might be willing to help you or charge you a kit rate to where they'll bring their own equipment on set and use it with yours. So that is also something to consider. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that stuff? Or anything to add?
Yeah, it's a lot. You really just have to consider, like you had said, what it is that you're looking to do. Some might argue that, you know, you can do a film without sound, or vice versa, because, you know, so like you can get away with like narratives and like shoot something and then record the dialogue later on and whatnot. It's not ideal, but the main thing is getting, for me, I think, you know, the most important will probably be like the camera, just because, I mean, but still, like you had said, like because I tell my friends all the time, I say, hey, like, you don't need a camera because, you know me, I have a camera, or you don't need this because this person has that, or whatever. So, you know, these types of discussions can get a little intimidating because there's so much to think about, but ultimately, if you're looking like just to the bare minimal, the bare minimal of what you need to actually produce something is a camera. So, but yeah, that's all I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I agree. And I also wanted to make a note that other people were saying as well is make sure you don't overspend on gear when you're starting out. Even when you start working, you want to be sure you can afford the gear that you get. So don't think that you need the best and the latest and the greatest, because it's going to be more expensive than you can handle most likely. And like I was talking about with the camera itself, if you were to go out and buy a, I don't know, an RE Mini, then you're going to need all those attachments and all those things that can work with that camera, the camera batteries that work with that camera, the memory cards that work with that camera. And a lot of those things are more expensive than if you bought like a DSLR camera for your first one, which only need maybe SD cards or something, which are, you know, smaller and less expensive than the higher grade cards. I'm not exactly sure what kind of cards that the RE Alexa Mini does use, but I do know that the higher end cameras start to use compact flash or CFast cards, which are much more expensive than just standard SD cards and things like that. So those are some things to take into account whenever you're looking into buying stuff. It's just, you don't always need the best and the latest. And if you do think you need it, just make sure that you're taking into account all the other factors that are going to go into that price. A camera body is just the body. Now you need the monitor, and you need the batteries, and you need the memory cards, and you need all this other stuff to make it work how you would like it to work. And you need and the other thing is, if you buy a very expensive camera, they're heavier, they're bigger than the smaller consumer ones. So you're going to need better tripods and better if you want to get a slider, you're going to need a better one or a dolly track or something to make it be able to be, to make it, to let it handle it, because the little small ones are not going to be able to handle that weight, and it's going to throw off the distribution of it. And the tripods, the ones that are very cheap, aren't going to be able to handle that kind of weight. And you don't want it to try to handle that kind of weight, because if you're spending that much on a camera, and if it's on a cheap tripod that falls over, well, now your camera might break. So those are some things to take into account whenever you're looking into gear at all. It's just making sure that you kind of figure out what you want, what you need, and work your way up instead of just buying the best from the get-go. If you can afford it and you take into account those other things, then sure, go ahead and buy the best. But you also kind of want to learn the gear as you go, so you can get better, surpass the gear, then buy the next upgrade for what you think you need when you understand it better, instead of just
Another
diving straight
thing,
into the most professional stuff, because then you're going to have a lot of things you don't really know what they're for or how they even work.
another thing I would argue is that learn, if you can't afford to buy the latest gear, or if it's between, or even if you can, but if it's between buying the latest gear or working with the gear you have and paying for a course so you can learn more about your craft or become better at it, so you don't, a lot of people rely so hard on the gear. They need that perfect camera to get that perfect image. They need this, they need that. At the end of the day, you also have to remember that if you do not work at your craft and being the best that you can be at it, and working your creativity and your vision, it's not going to matter if you have the best camera. Your people are gonna outdo you for jobs, because they've put more work into their craft, they've put more studying into it, they've put more practice into getting more creative images, better looks, that kind of thing, whether it be with editing, whether it be with just the camera. That's another thing you have to keep in mind. Don't be too reliant on the latest and greatest. Sometimes it really pays off to have ingenuity. No, more often than not, it pays off to have ingenuity, to have creativity with that lesser gear, because imagine what you can do with greater gear, and people look at that. They look at someone who has, like, okay, not the latest and greatest, but they do amazing things with it, and they're like, wow, this person's really talented, because that shows your talent. Now, it's easy to get a great image on an Arri Alexa, but if someone like the dude that got a freaking, not a Grammy, but like he got like an award for an iPhone 7 footage, that's real talent right there. That's talent. So keep that in mind too. Don't rely on your footage too much. Upgrade slowly, but remember to invest in your craft and being better at what you do first and foremost.
I'll even say I disagree on the point that it's easy to get footage. If you don't know what you're doing, it is not easy to get footage on a professional camera. You can get the best camera, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's still going to look like crap. So that's why I would suggest, making sure you start out somewhere where you think it is going to benefit you, and then you can start working on it, and you can see what you're missing, and then you can upgrade. Because a lot of camera equipment as well, if you keep it in good condition, it'll sell for a pretty good price used compared to how you bought it. And that way you can get back some of your money plus however long you had it to learn from it. So that's another thing to think about.
In yourself first,
Right. And another thing that a lot of people say is, like, when people are focused on gear and they're focused on what they need, they sometimes they buy these pieces of gear or these pieces of equipment that they think they're going to use all the time, because that's a very specific use that would be very good to use, but they end up not really using it because it only has that specific use and they don't actually need it that much. And so they ended up spending a bunch of money on something that they're hardly ever, if ever, going to use. So you want to take into account the value that you're going to get from the gear you look into buying. How much are you going to use it? how long does that kind of gear last? Because you also don't want to go to the other end. You don't want to go cheapest, because those things, they might not work as well. They might not have as much connectivity, and they might have, different pieces of gear that don't really connect well with them, or their flow is,
Cheap
their
on
workflow
it either.
here. What?
Yeah, don't cheap out either. Don't be like, oh yeah, I can do it with whatever.
Right. So I would say buy somewhere within your means and just do research into the different pieces of gear to see what you actually need and if it's going to be worth it to you. The last thing I was going to mention is something I forgot to mention about memory cards. Even just memory cards alone, depending on what you're trying to do, they have different read and write speeds. So sometimes you need the faster ones to be able to do stuff like 4K, when a larger capacity, like a 128 gigabyte card, might not work if it has like a lesser, if it's not as fast. If it can't read and write as fast, then it won't be able to handle the 4K because there's so much information coming in. RAW, things like that, they take up a lot of data and they come in quickly. So you have to have cards that are really fast and have a lot of capacity to hold all that data. So that's another thing to think about with memory cards. They can start getting expensive fast, and there's reasons why there's a cheap memory card that's 64 gigabytes and an expensive memory card that's 64 gigabytes. It's because of how fast they can read and write. So that's how fast they can get information in, and that's how fast they can transport it to your computer later. And when you're on the larger sets and you're doing things for like 4K or RAW, and you're trying to do it really quickly, and you need these cards back, and maybe you have to transfer the data on set so that you can get it back into the camera and keep going, then speed is your ally, and you want it to be really quick. But if you're doing it at the end of the day, or if you're recording something and you're going to put it to YouTube and you're just doing like a short little film with your friends and stuff, and you're going to offload it at the end of the day or the end of the week, and you can keep that on the same memory card, then you won't need as fast of a memory card as you would if you were doing it on a larger budget production, I mean.
But yeah, Raphael, to answer what he was saying, you definitely should start by figuring out, okay, what do I want to do with this footage? That is also going to help you in your research, because you're going to know, okay, I want it for this purpose. So I need to find things that will help me do this purpose better, this specific function. For example, if you're uploading to YouTube, you don't need MKBHD does this with us because he's bougie and he really likes red cameras. He uploads his videos on a red camera, but he himself said that YouTube can't even, he can't even download that much data. Like, it's a 4K camera, YouTube can't even support that. So you don't need like a 4K camera if you're uploading to YouTube, because it probably won't even support that.
Yeah. So does anybody have any questions or comments or anything else to add to the basic equipment stuff? All right, cool. So moving on from that, now we're getting really technical. This is the stuff about editing, and we're going to jump right into what codecs are. Codecs can get very complicated very fast.
Yes.
So if anyone has any questions in the middle, just cut me off and ask what your question is, and I'll try to answer it as best I can.
I always feel really stupid whenever I study these really complex things that have a bunch of names that feel super hard and complicated and scientific, even if they're not as complicated as they seem, which it wasn't. Like, once me and Coda started learning it, it was not as complicated as it seemed. But just because it has words, metadata, and all this crap and all this stuff, I was like, oh, my brain. Here we go.
Yeah. All right, so the first thing to know about a codec is it's a shortened acronym that means either compressor, decompressor, or coder, decoder, depending on who you talk to. Either way, it works the same. It's what's going to compress the data to be able to hold it on your camera or your memory card, and then it's going to decompress the data when it's playing it back on your device, like your computer that you're going to watch it on. So different codecs are going to compress it different amounts, and they do it in different ways. And so that's why you'll have different people that like different codecs, and they'll edit it in different codecs. So we're going to get into all this and talk about it a little bit. The first thing to understand, whenever somebody's talking about a file format, it's actually made up of the codec itself and the container. And a container is just an extension. It's just, well, it's not an extension. It's just the wrapper that everything's in. So it'll have like the audio and the video and the time code and subtitles and things like that. Those will all be in the container. And a container would be something like .mov or .mp4. It's like those extensions that you see at the end of a file whenever you create something. If you've ever done a video file and have it on your computer, you'll know they have different extensions like that. They'll be like .mov, .input p4. I don't know, there's a bunch of different ones, and we'll get into the different ones in a second, but the main ones are MP4 and MOV for now. And those just hold all the different information within it. And then you have the codec, which actually determines the quality of the video or the quality of the audio that is the codec is compressing down and how it's doing it. So that'll determine what the quality is, how good it is, and how well it works with editing. So when you look just at a file format, you're not going to know exactly how the file format doesn't really tell you what the quality is going to be. If you see that it's an MP4 file, that has nothing to do with how good or how bad it's going to look. But if you know what kind of codec it uses, that's how you're going to kind of determine how much data it's going to lose when it's trying to compress it down, and how much it's going to need to be changed around during editing to make it work really well. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you look at the picture, it kind of shows you when you have your video data, it uses that codec so that it compresses it down for your camera to hold it in. And then you put that into that box in the middle would be the wrapper. So it'd be like either MOV or MP4. You have the audio data being recorded from the audio recorder, and it's using an audio codec to compress that down. Those both go into the wrapper. And then to play it back, it goes from the wrapper back to the codecs to whatever you're trying to view it on. Another way to look at it is like this. A common codec used in consumer products is H.264. We'll delve into that a little deeper in a second, but the container is the MP4. So basically the box, if you were shipping a package, the box would be the container, and the thing on the inside that actually affects what it is the codec. Does that make sense, everybody? So just remember the codec plus the container.
Does it? Because no one said, I was like,
what?
He said, does that make sense? And everyone was really quiet. So I was like, does it?
Remember that the codec plus the container equals video file format. When you have different cameras, they're usually just going to give you the file format. So you kind of need to look into what that format holds. What codec does it use, and what container does it output to?
I know, guys, this is super fun stuff.
The reason why we have codecs in the first place is because if you just used uncompressed video, which would actually be raw, which we are starting to use more often, but the reason it's not used all the time is because it takes up a huge amount of space, and it needs a very large memory card and constant offboarding to your computer and things like that, because it just takes up so much space. So it's more expensive for storage, and it's more expensive for how many memory cards you need and how fast those memory cards get filled up. When you're shooting raw, there are different raw formats, but technically raw would be like not using a codec because it is not compressed, uncompressed video. And it's just a huge file. The reason we need compression is because it's losing data, it's kicking out data that we're not really going to notice as much. For our eyes aren't going to see every single thing that's being cut out. And it's just kind of getting rid of that data that's not really needed for the video to still look good.
So
But it
if you
does,
guys, oh, go ahead.
what? Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, if you guys have like any legitimate questions, like if you're actually confused, that's okay. I had to ask Coda to explain some things to me a few times. Just because when he like some of the like there were some explanations where I was like, what? And then when I saw someone else explain it, I was like, oh, okay, why couldn't that person explain it like that? So different people understand it in different ways. So if there's anything like that you didn't understand very well with that analogy or that explanation, he can try again, basically. So
Yeah.
don't feel worried about that.
It is very, there's a lot to it. So, I mean, if I get anything wrong, make sure to correct me so that we're all on the same page. But
Yeah.
for codecs alone, some of these, like the MP4, MOV, those are going to be the containers. They're the wrappers. H.264, ProRes, DNX, HD, H.265, all those are codecs. So you have 3 different kinds of codecs. You have your capture codec, and that's the one that the camera is going to capture. It's going to use that to compress it down to hold it on the memory cards in your camera.
Said it makes sense, just so you know.
Okay. So you have your capture codec that's your camera is using so that it can hold that information on the camera itself. You have your editing codec, and that's the one that's being used during your edit. Sometimes this can be the same as the one you capture, or sometimes it can be different depending on if you need it to be, and we'll get into that in a second. And then you have your delivery codec, and that's the one where you're exporting from your editing software, you're delivering it to that final codec depending on where it's going to go. If you're going to upload a short film to YouTube, you're probably going to want to use a different codec than if you're trying to show that same thing in theaters, because YouTube needs a different algorithm, a different codec to compress it down further so that it can fit it on its website. When a theater, you need it to be a lot larger, a lot less compressed, so that it will look good in the theater. And that's why you want to use different codecs. Capture codecs, some capture codecs are what's called high efficiency codecs. High efficiency codecs work by having keyframes that have all of the information in them, within the frames in between being interpreted by the frames on either side. So what that means is if I'm recording at 24 frames per second, if it's a really high efficiency codec, which means it's trying to cut out a bunch of information to get it on small files, as small as it can, then it might take keyframes like frame 1, frame 5, frame 10, or anywhere, any number in between. It might go every other frame, things like that. It just depends on how that codec works. But what it's doing is it's taking all of the information from keyframe 1 and keyframe 3, and then for keyframe 2, for frame 2, I mean, it's taking information from frame 1 and frame 3 and filling in the gap. So it doesn't actually hold as much information in that frame itself. It's just filling it in because it doesn't want to actually hold information for each individual frame. So it's only taking information from frame 1 and keeping it, and frame 3 and keeping it exactly as they come in when you're recorded. For frame 2, it's just kicking out all that information, and then it'll fill in the gap based on what the frame 1 and 3 look like. So it sounds a lot worse than it is. It sounds like it's kicking out a lot of your information. It's going to look chunky and weird, but really the cameras and how the codecs work, they can put it back together pretty well. And our eyes don't really notice because of how fast it flashes by. So it actually tends to work out pretty well, especially for things like YouTube and things like that.
And it's doing that in order to save space?
Yeah, it's doing that in order to make the file sizes as small as it can so that it can hold a bunch of it onto a smaller memory card or something like that. Let me see if I can actually bring up a picture of it. That'd be easier. High efficiency. You're muted. Priscilla's trying to talk, but she's muted.
Sorry. I was gonna say for me, it's a lot of the stuff. It wasn't that it was like that hard. It was just that I needed a visual, and I work better with visuals, ironically. And the it's just a lot of terms, and so it can be a little intimidating when you hear all the words and you're like, and then once you actually see a visual of it, you're like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, I can't really find the image that they used for it, which in this
You want me to
syllabus, if
look-
you watch the video on it, it shows it really well, but I'll try to see if I can.
Could
You
you
want
just
me to
try
look
and
for
find
it?
the timestamp in the video?
Yeah, which video is it? Do you remember?
No.
Okay, well, we are on subject 2, correct?
Yeah, codecs and transcoding.
Okay, so 1 second. Codecs and transcoding. So the first, I'm gonna name you the name of the videos. You tell me if you remember them. So the first one is Codecs, Editing Codes Explained.
Honestly, I'm not sure which one it came from. I mean, we watched a bunch,
Okay,
and
let me go through it then.
so let's see. Is it like
Okay, there's the first video.
code?
The guy goes through a bunch, and it's the guy with the big beard. Is that one?
Honey, I don't know. I don't remember exactly. I just remember they showed a picture of it, and they showed. I'm trying to see if I can find like a good representation of what I'm talking about.
Well, the
So,
first video has a lot of examples
let
and
me just see
representations.
something real quick.
So the first one has a lot of examples and representation, so I might send that one.
Yeah, keyframes.
Yes.
Can't really find the picture I'm looking at. Oh shoot, I don't know.
See, this is why I go through them.
Here's
and
what
I
I'm
send
gonna
them.
do instead. I'm just gonna take this picture right here. And basically what he showed was if you are using a high efficiency codec, then it'll look sort of like this, like how old film used to look, you know, how they have the little boxes where the picture would actually be stored, and then you'd put it against a projector, and that would make how you could see what it looked like. But if we're talking about digital, then we're just seeing different frames. So each box would be a different frame. And if you're shooting 24 frames per second, it means each second there's going to be 24 of these little boxes lined up like this in the digital camera. You're not actually going to see it, but like in the camera itself, it'll have each individual frame like that. So with a high efficiency codec, depending on the way it works, it might save the data from this first little box, the third box, and the fifth box, but it might not save the data for the second box and the fourth box. For the second box, it would just grab the information from the first box, and it would grab the information from the third box, and it would just interpolate what that keyframe would look like.
I have 2 videos. The second one explains something similar to what you're talking about with the boxes, like he explains it very well. And the first one explains a lot the process of like from your camera to the SD card, to the computer, to the editing software, blah, blah, blah. And it goes through all that. So if those 2 aren't helpful, you guys let me know. I'll go through the syllabus again and try to find the exact one he's talking about, because there were a lot of videos, so it is hard to remember the exact one he's thinking of. But those 2 I remember were pretty good. But if you still don't like can't have a visual, let me know and I'll go back through the syllabus and send it out sometime today or tomorrow.
All right. So it only keeps like different frames so that it can kick out the rest of the information, and it can just interpret what the next keyframe will look like based on, you know, the keyframes that it keeps. So if it keeps 3 and it keeps 1, then it's going to say, well, from keyframe 1 to keyframe 3, that guy's hand moves 3 inches. So in between it moving 3 inches, I'm going to have his hand move 1.5 inches. That way it moves 1.5 inches, and then the next frame it moves another 1.5 inches, making it move 3 inches in total. So the camera has to do like when you're editing, you really don't want to have a codec that's high efficiency because of this, because your editing system will have to figure out what that keyframe is supposed to look like. It doesn't hold the information of every single frame. And so if you click on a random frame, it might be one of those ones that has to do with, the keyframe before it, the keyframe after it, to figure out what that one would look like. This might make a lot more sense once we start talking about interframe as well, because interframe compression is what this basically is. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Basically, all you need to know is it's going to have very small files, but it's not going to hold on to data for each and every frame. And that's to make the file sizes a lot smaller, so you can hold all that information on like a smaller memory card, or even a large memory card if you're filming all day. But when you get it into editing, you are going to want to change it to something else so that the editing is easier, because otherwise the computer will have to work a lot harder to figure out what each and every frame looks like. So that's I'll leave it there for now. If we're looking at interframe versus intra-frame compression, this is what it looks like. So we were just doing that where we were saying like, oh, the middle boxes don't have any information, but the other ones do. That's kind of what this is. Intra-frame keeps information for each and every frame, and you can see it in the picture. The guy standing in the middle, he's waving his arm back and forth. And that's the whole clip. So intra-frame compression, if you have a codec that's using intra-frame compression, it is keeping the information for each and every frame, which means that it's going to be easier on your editor, but it's going to be a lot larger file sizes for your camera and for your computer. Interframe compression, it only keeps the differences between the frames that are encoded. So if we have that first frame that has all of its information, it kicks out, because that guy's standing pretty much in the same place every single frame, it's noticing that, and the codec goes, oh, well, we don't need that information. We'll just put frame 1 on there since he's standing in the same spot. But his arm moves, so we need to keep just his arm information and overlay that over the other one, so that now it'll be him standing there with his arm extended out a little bit.
I don't know.
What was that? Okay. And so what it does is it just keeps the differences, the changes in the frame. It doesn't hold on to every single piece of information like the other compression does. Intra-frame codecs keep each frame exactly as it is, even if the guy's standing in the same spot, and even if the background's the same, it's going to keep all that information for each one. Interframe compression is going to only keep whatever changes from frame to frame. And so high efficiency, I believe, yeah, Mel, I believe high efficiency is always interframe because of the way interframe works. Don't quote me on that, but just because of what I know from intraframe, it keeps all the information. So I don't think high efficiency would be that, because it's not kicking out different frames, it's keeping everything. But for an interframe compression codec, it's only keeping what changes. And then so now if we bring this into our editor, right, that picture on the bottom, if it was really only keeping the changes for these 6 frames after that first one, then that means like every 7th frame, it would hold on to all the data. But for all the frames in between, you would click on the frame, and then the computer would have to figure out, it would have to go back to the first frame and go, okay, this is what it looks like, plus this frame, plus that frame, plus this frame. And then it adds it all together to make it look like the final output, which would be this middle picture. So because of that, when you're editing, you really don't want to edit in an interframe compression codec. And we'll get into this a little bit later. It's called transcoding, when you change the codec so that it works better for your editing software. If not, your computer is going to be doing a lot more work to figure out what that frame looks like, because as we can see in this bottom picture, it doesn't have the guy there. So it has to go back to the very beginning to figure out what is this, what's supposed to be here, what's supposed to be on these edges, what's supposed to be in the middle. And then it goes back to the first one and goes, oh, okay, it's a person and he looks like this and he's standing there. And maybe there's a tree in the background and it's in the corner. And then it adds all that together to make that final frame. And it only changes that little part of the frame where his arm moves. So now the whole frame looks like him standing there with his arm extended out, like the middle picture in the top. But if you were editing on intra-frame compression, you could just click on that middle frame and it'd already be there. The computer would already know what it looks like because it has all that information. It doesn't need to go back to the first frame and figure out where was he standing and what does it look like and add it all together. It's already there in that middle frame. Does anyone have any questions or anything about that stuff so far? Okay, so like I said, when you are shooting raw in your camera, that is uncompressed video, and that's going to be the largest file sizes because it's keeping every single piece of information it can. But even then, in different cameras, you're going to have different raw codecs. I know Red has its own called Red Raw or something like that. And then Blackmagic has B Raw, which is Blackmagic Raw. And these other cameras, they all have their own variations on it. So whatever camera type you have, you're still going to have to look into what that raw does and then see what settings you want to adjust to get it either higher quality or lower quality so that it has the file size you need. Raw can't really be displayed straight from camera to the computer. If you're like, if you were to load your files onto your computer, it's not going to be able to display raw because it doesn't know what it looks like. You have to get like a specific video viewer. On most of the cameras have their own software that can do this. I know Blackmagic Raw has it. You download it from the website and it will be able to view what the Blackmagic files look like. A lot of the editing software, once you get it and import it into the editors, they'll be able to view it because they now have the ability to. But you can't just take it and view it right off the bat whenever you put it into your computer. You're going to either have to use an editing software or you're going to have to use their specific viewer to be able to see what those footage files look like when you shoot raw. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's why those files are just so huge, is because they have so much data in them that you can do a bunch in post-production. You can adjust a bunch of stuff when you have raw files. They're just going to take up a crap ton of space. So you just need to keep that in mind if you're trying to shoot raw. So typically speaking, of course, if you look at this picture, intra-frame is going to be better, and it's definitely going to work better when you're editing. A lot of the consumer cameras are going to use interframe compression, the bottom one. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not like it's going to ruin everything. It just means that it's not going to be as high of quality, but it's going to be a lot more, it's going to save a lot more space. So you're not going to need those giant memory cards that read things really fast. The other thing about intraframe, like I was talking about with memory cards earlier, is because it's saving all the data from each frame to frame, you're going to need a large memory card, but also one that can read things very fast, because it needs to read all that data 24 frames per second if you're shooting film, 30 frames per second if you're shooting video. And each and every frame is going to need to keep all its information. So that's a lot for the camera to do all at once.
You know what frames like interframe compression or intraframe compression the Red camera does? I'm just curious.
I think the red camera can do either or.
Okay.
I know,
I'm
like,
looking
I
at-
know the red camera can shoot raw, but I also believe that you can change which one you want, depending on what codec you're using. I think it has different codecs. I'm not exactly sure.
And what would the file extension
What is the
be?
red
Oh,
file? Native video file format used by Red. High resolution video cameras compressed using Red code. It's called Red code. An advanced wavelet technology codec that creates visually lossless images. Red cameras shoot in a resolution called 4K, which is much greater than 2K resolution. Yeah, basically explaining what 4K is. But yeah, so they have their own called Red code apparently.
okay.
Okay.
According to
Yeah, that's why, like, whenever you're looking into a camera, you'd have to look into specifically what it does, because each camera is going to compress things differently.
ProRes. Sorry, it says Phil Holland confirms that Red Komodo can record in 4K, 2K ProRes HQ, and 422 in addition to the already confirmed Red code RAW. More on that a bit later.
If you're shooting on a red, you'll probably be shooting raw, and that means that it's basically intraframe. I mean, it's not really either because it's raw, but it's basically intraframe because it's holding on to as much information as possible. But if you're using red, or if you're using ProRes, that's Apple's, and it's intraframe, so it's going to hold on to all that information as well. But certain cameras have the ability to change what codec it's using to record, especially if you just use, like, some cameras, they just call it highest settings, lowest settings. And then if you change between those, they might change what kind of compression it's doing to your images.
And that would reflect in the file extension, is it, when you download?
The file extension, no, because that would just be the container it's in, which would be like either MP4 or MOV. Any codec, you won't find, like, how do I explain this? There's the container it's in doesn't really affect what codec it's using. Different codecs can be in the same container. You can have an interframe codec in an MP4 file, or you can have an intra-frame codec in an MP4 file. You'd have to just see what kind of codec you're using based on whatever settings you are doing on the camera.
But they also have to be compatible, right? Doesn't mean that it can go into any file.
I mean, yeah, you won't see, I don't know exactly if it's, like, impossible, but you're not going to see certain codecs with certain containers. Like an MP4 file, you won't really see certain codecs in there, but for the most part, I'm pretty sure they can handle, like, a lot of them, or the majority of them. Which is why the container itself, the extension, it doesn't
matter. Okay.
Yeah.
So how would you know when you download the file? Like, let's say the cinematographer forgot which setting it was on. I'm just giving a very hypothetical situation. And when you download the file, so will it come up on the editing software, or like?
What codec it's in? I'm pretty sure it's in the metadata for the file. Yeah. You should be able to see
preferences to see what all that data should be there in the preferences. If it shows up, like, a lot of your editors will try to open it, but it'll just be like an empty slide. It'll just be audio because it can't read the video. So nowadays, like, a lot of the softwares have actually caught up, and a lot of the what did you guys call it? The containers have gotten. I know QuickTime has been good about playing Blackmagic files. They haven't made it so that it reads B-raw yet, but like my original Blackmagic, I would be able to play all those files in a QuickTime versus having to open an editor just to view the files.
And MOV is QuickTime, like it originated with QuickTime, right?
Yes. So, like, if you know anything about photography, it's kind of like the difference between a raw picture and JPEG. Like, JPEG is designed for, uploading to the internet. RAW is like, everything is there. So like you could downgrade it as much as you want and all that detail would still be there. But JPEG is like, you know, you have to convert it a certain way. So that's what really he's getting into with this. Well, it sounds to me like you're getting into like lossy and lossless compression.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah, I
like,
was just gonna say JPEG is a lossy format.
yeah. So it's like you can downscale it. It really all depends on what settings you put it in. But some settings are meant for like, you know, websites and stuff like that. But if you notice, you blow up the picture, it looks all blotchy because, you know, it's just not in the right compression rate or whatnot.
Mhm.
So like I know YouTube has like for your profile on YouTube, like there's a specific requirement to have like a backsplash on your YouTube page. It's not the same as like Facebook or something like that. It's some ridiculous number, but it has to be like in order for it to come out in a good resolution, it has to be some kind of, I don't know the compression rate for it, but
Mhm.
that's what all he's getting at is like, it's specifically for, you know, internet and, you know, projecting and, you know, upscaling and downscaling purposes and stuff. Is that information going to be there?
Great.
Yeah. It's basically the reason why there's so many of these and why it's so complex is just because we have so many different devices that we can watch these things on, or that we can what we can deliver it to. If it's meant for online websites, if it's meant for streaming, if it's meant for the theater, if it's meant for somebody's computer or their phone, then they're going to need, or like, you know, something like YouTube, it's going to need different compression levels to make the file size work with those different devices, because phone isn't going to be able to handle as much data to be able to view it as a theater would, because the theater's made specifically so it can see it at the higher resolution on the big huge screen. But for that tiny little screen that you have on your phone, it's not going to be able to view the same file at the same speed. It's going to be buffering a lot and lagging a lot because it has to load so much information to be able to see what is going on, which is why you have the different codecs where you export it to something else. That's why whenever somebody has a film, they have a master file where it's the finished complete version, and from that master file they export it to different codecs, different things, different formats, so that way it can play on different devices. If it's, you know, if they're going to upload the trailer to YouTube and then they're going to show the trailer in the theater, then they'll have two different trailer exports for it. So one can work better in the theater and one works better on YouTube. Things like
Mhm.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And YouTube itself will compress down the video based on, you know, whatever it needs to make sure it fits, because YouTube doesn't have unlimited space. And even if it did, streaming to people online, that data needs to be you know, streamed to them through their internet service, and people don't always have the fastest one. So YouTube doesn't want to make these file sizes ginormous to where everyone that's trying to watch YouTube.
That's why
I don't know.
it'll like automatically reduce your resolution when you're watching a video if your internet signal is crap, because they'll try to like make it so that it's easier for them to it's less heavy on your internet basically. It's really annoying too, because
Yeah,
sometimes
so if you were ever to like upload to YouTube, download that video and re-upload it to YouTube, if you kept doing that, you would see it degrade in quality because it keeps compressing it more each time you upload it. There's actually a test that somebody did on that very topic, that they uploaded a video to YouTube and kept re-downloading it and uploading it. And eventually the video just looked really hideous and purple and weird because it just kept compressing it down farther and farther and farther.
so
It
the
doesn't
funny
really,
thing-
it's not really noticeable until you do it over and over and over again. But that's why
Yeah,
you
Well,
have to
and
keep
and
rerunning.
it's noticeable with certain things. So like I think I remember like back in a previous semester we were talking about how if you're filming like particulate, that really gets compressed in YouTube videos,
Mhm.
like, you know, confetti or snow or something like that, then it's highly noticeable that YouTube will just make it like really pixelated, like the quality will lower.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually two video. Well, I don't know if there's more, but that I know of, there's one guy who did it in like, I don't know if it was like 2008 or something, but like pretty early on. I think it was like 2016. I don't know, some year where the internet, the cameras weren't even that good yet, or weren't that accessible, and he did it on like a pretty standard camera, and it looked absolutely awful. And then MKBHD Marquez Brownlee did it again. I think it was like 2019 or something, where he showed the difference from his red camera, and he basically uploaded it to YouTube. I think it was like 10,000 times or something like that. It was yeah, I think it was 10,000 times, and you could see the difference in the degradation every single time. And he basically just uploaded the same video and showed it over and over with the amounts of compression each time.
Yeah. Yeah, and like, so YouTube will do it itself. Now, when you're editing and when you are getting ready to export, that is also going to compress it down. When we were talking about delivery codecs, that's the one that in this instance, in this picture, this would be, I believe this is Premiere. It's showing that the format up at the top right, H.264, that's going to be the codec they're using to compress it down. And then you have a lot of options that you can choose to tell it how much it's going to get compressed or how much data to leave in there. We will look a lot more into exporting and compression specifically, like with delivery codecs. We'll be looking into that more later on in the semester as well. I'm just going to quickly jump in a little bit of this stuff. When you are exporting, let's say you did do interframe compression, which would be this one on the bottom. If you did edit it in interframe and you're getting ready to deliver it with an interframe codec, then you have the option of choosing how many frames it saves and how many frames it fills in the differences for. So the more frames, like the farther you get, if you say, I want to save every 10th frame, and then you fill in the information for the rest, that's probably going to look very ugly. So you want to think about how many frames you might be able to get away with doing, like 3 frames, 4 frames, saying save the information from frame 1 and frame 4, fill in the information for the other 2 frames, and do that every 4 frames. And then it'll fill in the information for the rest of the 3 frames in between each 4th frame. So you have the ability to choose that, to tell the codec how many frames to skip and how many frames to save, and then it'll fill in the information for the rest. And the farther you do that, the more information is not there, which means the more information it's kind of making up as it goes, and that makes it look a lot uglier if you're going to go if you're going to spread it out too far, saying every 10th frame or every 20th frame or something crazy like that. If you're uploading to YouTube or Vimeo, it actually is recommended to export at a higher bitrate. Bitrate is another thing you have the option to choose. Bitrate just means how many colors are within that image. And so the higher the bit rate, the more color information it has and the better it will look, but also the file sizes will be a lot larger. And the way our eyes work, we don't really see color as much as we see light. So when you cut out some of that color information, our eyes aren't really going to notice. And that's why they cut down on the bit rate. They cut down some of the colors because we're not really going to notice it. But if you do it to a very drastic degree, then we will start to see that it looks a little faded or ugly, kind of like when you shoot log or raw and you see it very unsaturated. But you have the option to tell it what the bitrate should be, what your target bitrate is, what the maximum one is. And there's also these different things called variable bitrate and constant bitrate. And we're going to get into all that later in the semester as well. because that is it's going to affect the quality as well, depending on what you're shooting and what's in your video. The more movement, the more things that are happening in each frame, then the more data that it needs to display all that stuff, especially if you're using a interframe compression, and that's usually the one that you're going to be exporting to. It's saving all the differences. So if the whole frame is different, each and every frame, then it has to save every single frame. But if, for instance, this girl here on the image, she's going to be standing there, she might be moving around, grabbing different things, showing how to make cookies. That door in the background, those cupboards, all that stuff's going to stay in the same place. Unless the camera itself is moving, then all that stuff's going to stay in the same place. And you don't really need to keep 2 frames of that information, because you can just copy the first frame and say, it looks like that. But if she moves, you just save that information to make sure you're showing her movement. Mel said, is that connected to frame blending or it's something totally different? Which one? Above question is referring to interframe compression. Frame blending. That's something I haven't even come across, so I don't know.
I mean, it's right there in the screenshot you have. It's a box that's checked, use frame blending at the bottom.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked into that yet. I would say that probably means that it is trying to blend the frames as best as it can, but I'm not exactly sure, because if that's checked and you can uncheck it, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly.
I mean, I know that it has to do with like it kind of has to do with like taking 2 frames that are next to each other and then creating like a middle frame in between, I think.
I think it's about smoothness. Like it's trying to add extra.
All right, so here's the thing.
What?
Yeah.
Okay. What are blended frames? Frame sampling repeats or removes frames as needed to reach the desired speed. Frame blending repeats frames, but it also blends between them as needed to help smooth the motion.
Okay, so it's just smoothing the motion. If it feels too jerky and you want to add in a little bit more smoothness, the computer will automatically figure out what it might look like in between those 2 frames.
You want to say something, Brian?
Yeah, what happens is, okay, so like you had gave the example of skipping a frame. So if you were to use your clicker and you click over 1 and then 2, you've moved over 2 frames, but the frame in between is blurred. So every 3rd frame is in focus, and then the ones that are blurred, if there's movement, you'll notice like a motion blur. So that's what it's referring to. And you get to decide, like you had also brought up, Lakota, like how many frames in between will it blur in between motion before it decides it wants to get
reset. Yeah.
So that's what it's referring to. So like every frame in between, when there's motion, it's gonna be like a blur.
Right.
Because it's blending 2 frames.
Yeah, it's blending 2 frames. It really doesn't refer to like the motion as far as like because in photography, if you leave your shutter open long, you'll have this motion blur. But this one is kind of because you're constantly taking frames. This one it's kind of directing you can either in camera or in post what frames in between are going to be blurred to kind of get a smoother motion. You could actually adjust this in your television. If you got a smart TV, these smart TVs, because I had to readjust mine. Like you notice when you see them on display, it looks weird. Like it just kind of looks, it just looks weird. Or it's hard to explain the look of it, but you can go in the settings and adjust it so it's not as, yeah, it'll blend everything out so it looks more smooth as opposed to like when you first get it on display.
Oh, kind of like the.
Well, yeah, this is the. Sorry, what?
I was like, kind of like a soap opera effect thing.
Exactly. Yeah. This is like the same issue of the 24 FPS thing where things look more natural when the motion is more blended. And if they're only like completely clear frames every time, then it looks more like a soap opera.
Correct.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
which freaks
Yeah,
me
because
out
we
every
just
time.
we like we're so used to cinemas showing things at 24 frames per second or video showing at 30 frames per second, that if something's shot on 60, it's too clear and it looks weird. A lot of people don't like it. Some people love it, but most people don't really like it that much, which is why a lot of
It
those smart
feels like
TVs.
slow motion or lagging or something to me.
And
It is
also this
very
is why
different. Yeah.
this is why animation does like what they call smear frames too, is they're basically emulating that in animation, where they will, like, if a character is moving like their arm really fast, instead of just showing a static arm in a different position every time, they'll have like one frame that shows like like the arm, like it looks like the arm is smearing as it's moving.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's to add that motion blur so that it looks like, because when we see things in the real world and we see like a car drive by real fast, it looks kind of blurry because it's going so fast, so we don't see it clearly for every single second that it's going.
Definitely.
And
Yeah,
that's
because
the
we're not
same thing with like
computers.
video and watching. But if you're looking at a video, you're seeing it on a flat screen, so you're not actually watching any real movement. You're watching the movement that the camera captured, and that's
It's so
usually why people
freaky
like
to
it
think
better.
about too. I'm just watching a bunch of images move together.
Right.
Like
Yep,
it's so weird.
movie magic.
But yeah, all right. So when you're exporting, you have a bunch of different options like that, and we'll delve into exporting a bit more at a different time, because there's so much to it. But just like you can choose how big that file size is going to be, how much information it's going to keep. The other thing to think about when talking about bitrate, though, when you're choosing to export, is if you're going to upload something to YouTube, it actually is recommended to have a higher bit rate because it compresses it down itself. And so having a higher bit rate, you'll have a better quality, and then YouTube will compress it down to a little bit of a lesser quality. But if you were going to upload to your own website or something like that, you want the video to play back fairly well. You don't want it to be laggy and take a long time for anyone to watch it, because they're going to get annoyed and get out of the video. They want to watch it and see it clearly and see it run smoothly. And their internet needs to be able to handle the data going in and coming out. So you don't want to set the bit rate too high, because then there's too much information for the website to show people unless they have a really fast internet. And that's why that option is there, so that you can choose how much to change it around. And in a single frame, when it has a lot more movement, it's going to have, the bit rate needs to be higher because there's more stuff happening. And we'll get into that more later on at a different time. But that's just something to think about. Don't always try to think you need to set everything to the highest setting, because that's actually bad. And it's not really going to make the video look too much better unless, you're going drastically from one end to the other, then you'll notice. But if you're somewhere in the middle and you're going a little bit on the lower side or going a little bit on the higher side, the changes aren't going to be that noticeable. And you'll see it if you start editing and doing that kind of thing, exporting and all that. But yeah, let me see. So some of these codecs, when they're compressing and then they're uncompressing, they're what's called lossless. And that's like, it's compressing it down, but not taking out too much of the information to where it's going to lose quality the more you compress it, the more you use that codec. Basically, it's trying to keep the quality of the content the same, but because it's doing that, it's keeping more information in there, and the file sizes again are going to be much larger. All of these different aspects that go into codecs and all of these things, they're all just to save space. They're all to get the file sizes to a good amount so that it works to upload and view and stream. That's all this stuff is. Everything, so it can hold it in the camera, so it can edit it, so all these devices can read it and adjust it and watch it. That's all these things are for. Every single part of like codecs and everything, it's all about how much data is getting kicked out so that it saves space, so that it makes the file size smaller. So we're going to talk about different aspects. What was that?
You okay? I think Mel just got shocked.
No, that wasn't me. I think it's
Oh, okay.
Vita, maybe.
Okay.
She's got her mic on.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so when you're having a lossless file, it's going to try to kick out less information so that the quality doesn't change. And then it restores it to pretty much the exact same as the original. If you can look at this picture, you see once it gets compressed down and then it gets uncompressed or decompressed, it restores it to pretty much the same size. For a lossy codec, that is going to have the original. It's going to kick out a lot more information, a lot more data, so that it can have a very small size, a very compact file. And then when it restores, it doesn't restore it to the, like, it doesn't fully restore it. And that's where the lossiness comes in. It doesn't, it kicks out information to where it's losing some of that data. Most of the time, if you're only exporting it once, you aren't really going to notice that the codec lost information. A lot of the information it kicks out is repetitive information, like frame by frame. With the interframe stuff, it kicks out the stuff that's the same and keeps only the differences. Or it's going to kick out some of that color information that we aren't really going to notice as much. But the more you keep exporting it and you keep changing it around, and if you keep bringing it back to your editor and then exporting it again, the more you'll see that a lossy codec is going to really start to degrade the quality and really start to be noticeable. Which is why when you're editing, especially when you have that interframe codec, so when you're using, this codec on the bottom, that's only keeping the differences. They say sometimes you might want to do what's called transcoding it, changing it to a codec that's intra-frame, something like ProRes or DNX. Those are the two main ones that are used for editing because they're intra-frame. They keep information for each and every frame. So you change it to that codec, and that way when you're editing it, it has that lossless. It's lossless and it's not losing as much information, and the computer's able to read it easier whenever you're editing with it. That way when you're, especially if you have a large team of different editors and things like that, you want to try to lose as little amount of information as possible. And so you don't want to have the edit workflow be on a lossy codec. You want it to be a lossless codec, something like ProRes or DNX. And that way, when you're done editing, you can bring it back into a different codec, even a lossy codec, and it's only going to lose a little bit of the information one time instead of losing information over and over again as you edit and switch it to different applications and whatever else. But as you can see in this picture, it's a little small. Let me see if I can get it bigger.
That is not a large picture.
No, it's not.
No, it's not.
Wait a minute.
You can zoom in with your finger.
I'm trying to like do it, but as you can see, like it looks blurry because I zoomed into a small picture, but it really isn't that different.
Like a million times.
Because it's hard to remember on the Mac which one you had to press. Because I was like, I have a Windows keyboard for my Mac, so I have to like think about which button is on the Mac and then which button that translates to on the Windows keyboard. So it took a little bit, but you can see like comparatively, there's not that much more information on the lossless than there is on the lossy when it was only edited through once. There is a little bit more on that lightning bolt. There's a little more detail and a little more color information there.
And I'm sure there'd be even more if it wasn't zoomed in a million times.
Yeah, I mean, it looks blurry and blotchy right now because it was such a small picture, but you can kind of see the difference between it being like, it doesn't really change that much. And that color information that's lost, even if you have to like really look at it to kind of see, oh yeah, maybe, you know, the clouds on the right look a little greener, I guess, and the ones on the left look maybe a little more blue. So a little bit of that color information is lost. But it's not too noticeable. So it's not like you need to use lossless only or your video is going to be crap. It just, when you're editing and when you're switching it around to different apps and different editors, then you want to have lossless so that you're not losing information over and over again when it starts to get noticeable. But it also depends on what you are editing, I guess, because some things, like if you use a lossy, so this is actually showing a difference between, oh shoot, that's way too big.
Because it's still zoomed in.
We're having a proportions.
So if you look at this one, it's saying the original was 112 kilobytes. The lossless one lost 4 kilobytes only, so it's 108 kilobytes, and the lossy one lost about 62 kilobytes, so it's less than half of the original size. And it starts to get a little blurry, and it starts to lose some of that information. I don't, you know, lossy can, it depends on how much the codec is kicking out. If it's going to make it look very ugly, or if it's going to look the same like we saw in the previous picture. Some codecs are trying to be as small of sizes as possible, and so they kick out so much information that, you know, it doesn't look very good unless you're viewing it on really small devices, or it's for a very specific use, like, you know, YouTube only, or for phone view only, something like that. But usually lossy and lossless, they aren't really as noticeable if you're just editing it and exporting it once or twice or whatever. But yeah, as you can see, like lossy does tend to kick out a lot of that information, and so it can become uglier looking.
And just seeing the like difference in size of the file itself with lossless exporting, is that more so what happens when the original is a raw file? Because I have noticed sometimes I have tried to export things as lossless and the file size ended up getting way bigger.
Oh, like where? I don't know exactly, because I do know that it depends on what kind of raw codec it was using, because, you know, there's different kinds. So a raw file, some cameras say raw, but really it's more of like a mix between raw and log.
Oh yeah, that's definitely.
Yeah, I'm not trying to claim that the thing that I used was raw to begin with, but like, I guess if something is already compressed and then you make it lossless, then it makes it way bigger because it uncompresses it.
Oh yeah, like if your original file was this lossy file and you are trying to use a lossless codec, it's going to add in extra bit rate and stuff like that, but there's not actually going to be any new information in there.
So it's just going to bog down.
That's actually a good thing that you brought up. So when we were talking about codecs, the capture codec is going to be all the information you are going to have for that file. If you are capturing it, a file, and it's using a interframe codec, and it's trying to compress it down to a very small size, and let's say it does to this right picture, and it does 50 kilobytes. And then you're trying to edit it, so you're going to bring it into ProRes, and you're going to transcode it to ProRes. ProRes, the file might be larger; it might become 108 kilobytes, but it's not going to have 60. It's not going to have 58 extra kilobytes of information, not real information, not useful information. It's just going to have the space for that because you already recorded it, you already captured it to its max amount. It can only be 50 kilobytes or less. It's not going to magically be able to create more data when you bring it into a higher, a lossless codec.
So it's like rendering something at 1080p when you shot it at 720, pretty much.
Yeah. It's not going to actually be 1080p just because you're trying to make it larger. It's going to still be 720, but it's going to be expanded to 1080p, which is going to make it look weird and ugly.
Oh yeah, they say that they were talking about that with YouTube, how I think YouTube had like the 1080p and then it had like another one which was like HD or something like that now. And they were saying that like don't be fooled, just because YouTube has the option for you to watch it in 4K or HD does not mean you're actually going to watch it in 4K or HD. If your screen does not support it, or if the video does not support it, if the video is shot in 1080, or rendered in 1080, it's not going to magically turn into a 4K file or 4K image or anything like that.
Yeah, so whatever you capture it at, that's going to be your max amount of data. No matter how big the file size gets after that, it's not going to be able to add any color information because all you had was what you recorded.
I guess maybe I'm a little confused on the decompressing aspect of it, because you're saying that like when you make something into a codec, it compresses and then it decompresses it when you view it. So it's like when it, so is that more that it has more information than it says it has?
No, so when it decompresses, it's just to like show it at the original file. If you shot it and it was 50 kilobytes of information and you compress it, it's going to maybe go down to 40 or 25 kilobytes. And then when it's decompressing it to show the viewer it might go up back to like 40 kilobytes, 45. It usually is not going to return to the original size, not exactly what it was recorded at, but it's not going to, you can't get more information than what you've captured, than what you've recorded. So if you only captured 50 kilobytes, you can, that's all you got is 50 kilobytes. No matter how big the file size gets, it's not actually adding new color information and new data. It's just making the file size bigger for, I mean, there is kind of a reason to do that, honestly, to make it bigger for the edit. So that way, whenever it's kicking out information, it's just kicking out the useless stuff and it's not taking away anything from the 50 kilobytes that you recorded. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. Yeah, I guess I'm talking about like the middle, like not like I'm talking about like the middle step rather than from the actual raw, like if you have compressed something, but like you said there will be some loss, but like you said, like if it's originally 50, then when you compress it, it shows that it's 40, but then when you view it, you're actually seeing 45. So what the size is listed as is smaller than what it is before you metaphorically open the box to view it.
So what's happening is if you how fax machines work, it scans.
Like I'm also thinking about zip files here. Like zip files create things that are like really, really small files that contain large amounts of information.
Exactly, that's what it's doing. So it's taking everything like an image. So say you take a picture, the camera is going to read it, and it's all algorithms and numbers. So it's going to say, all right, we're going to take all these numbers to create these images, and we're just going to remember it. We're not going to actually save the image. We're just going to save the numbers and then reinsert them into whatever codec that you decide that you want to do it. So if you go in an editor, you're telling an editor, all right, these numbers make up this image, which is actually what the camera saw at that time. So the camera is taking it, shrinking it down, saying, hey, we can shrink it down to this, but we're going to tell the computer that. So when it exports it, it's going to be at a larger file size. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So if we were looking at these pictures in order and we are recording it, picture on the left, I could say that's picture 1. Picture in the middle, I could say picture 2, and picture on the right, I could say picture 3. Now, if I get out of this file and I go and I say, hey, Mel, picture 1, you know what I'm talking about. So like for a camera, if it's all zeros and ones and things like that, so it'll be able to display what that image was without actually keeping that picture. Does that make sense? Like, so it'll know what that looks like just from all of the like zeros and ones that it remembered. And then it'll be able to take those numbers and decode it to show what that image looks like. That way, when I say 1, I mean picture on the left. So I'm telling the camera 1, and then it's taking that number and redisplaying what that means. Because I told it, number 1 is this picture on the left. That's what it looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm sorry for derailing. I think like the things that I'm thinking about are like too niche for the conversation that we're having.
No, you're good. Like that's how it works. It's very technical, and that's why it's very hard to like.
Because like I just don't get the idea. I just don't get the idea of like if something is lost, if something like if you're calling something lossless, then it also shouldn't add anything.
Right. And it just depends on what the original file was and how large it was. Because I can take something from Zoom. I used to do this back when we started our meetings, actually. Our first meetings, I was taking it and I was putting it into Premiere and I was exporting it. And the file size was like 6 times larger than it was when it came just directly from Zoom. So whatever compression they're doing on their video, whenever it goes to my computer, clearly I was using a bigger compression model that was having more data that didn't need to be there. And so it was just making a larger file out of nothing, because I said, maybe in this actual meeting, once we're done, the bit rate might hold, it might be like 5 or whatever. I don't know exact terms, but let's say the bit rate's 5 per second or whatever. And then when I go into editing it, I say that each second should have 20 for the bit rate. Well, now it's adding 4 times as much or 3 times more to each second of video, even though it doesn't really need to, because it doesn't have that much information in the first place. And that's how it can go from being smaller to being larger, depending on what codec you're using.
Right. Even though in this example you have here, like the lossless does actually lose stuff. So if you were to give it the identical settings, it would lose stuff. So would you be able to compensate for that by giving it higher settings?
I don't believe, no, because it's still a compression model. It's not unless it's raw, it's still going to lose some data. It's called lossless because it's not really noticeable. 4 kilobytes out of 112, you're not really going to notice it. But lossy.
But I mean, maybe that's not the best example picture then, because her face is obviously much blurrier.
Yeah, that's true. Well, let's see. I mean, it's kind of like this one then. Like you don't really notice the difference as much. Like lossy is losing more information than lossless, but the original is probably pretty close to lossless. And you're not really going to see any differences between the original and lossless, but you might see a tiny bit of difference between the original and the lossy image, just because of how much data it's kicking out. The most.
But I don't know what the original looks like.
Right. I don't have a picture for you now. But I mean, you can just picture it like lossless just means it's kicking out information that is not really going to be noticed. Lossy just means it's kicking out information that it's not really going to be noticed, but it's also kicking out a little bit more information to make the file size smaller. So the more it does that, the heavier it kicks out, the more it is going to be noticeable. Lossless doesn't mean there's like absolutely nothing being lost from it. There's still something being lost from it.
So even if you set it to much higher settings, you're still going to lose stuff than what the original was.
Okay, let me look up something.
I'm not sure exactly for that specific situation. I just know whenever you use lossless, it does actually kick out some information. I know like they call 422 lossless, even though, 444 would really be lossless. If you're talking
Okay,
about,
that's a color thing, right?
right, and that's kicking out, half the color information right there, and it's still calling it lossless just because we don't notice color as much as we do with like light.
Does lossless compression lose data? Lossless compression techniques, as their name implies, involves no loss of information. If data has been losslessly compressed, the original data can be recovered exactly from the compressed data. Is lossless permanent? Lossless compression restores and rebuilds file data in its original form after the file is decompressed. Specifically, data is permanently removed, which is why the method is also known as irreversible compression. 1 second. Does lossless compression reduce image quality? Compression can be lossy or lossless. Lossless compression means that as the file size is compressed, the picture quality remains the same. It does not get worse. So I think it really depends on from what I'm understanding here, it must depend on the software you're using and if it can support that lossless data. If it's compressing, then it obviously isn't supporting it, right? Like just a lay perspective here. Because if it's saying that it doesn't lose data, and you're losing data, then it must not be knowing how to read it well, right? Again, I know.
No, like I said, I'm pretty sure lossless, you still lose some amount of data. It's just so negligible that it doesn't really matter. I mean, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But from what I can tell, from what I've always heard, lossless doesn't actually mean that all of the data from every single bit is exactly the same.
It says, when should you use lossless compression? Lossless compression is used in cases where, hey, I'm making it clear, where it is important that the original and the decompressed data be identical. So I don't know. I'm gonna do more research into that because now I'm curious, and Mel's confusing me, and she's kicking your butt, and so I need to know now. I need to know now. So I'm gonna do some research and I'll get back to you, Mel.
All right.
Because you gotta remember, we're learning this too, okay? Don't be so hard on us, Mel.
I'm not trying.
I'm joking with you. I'm just joking. I'm sorry. Again, sense of humor. My sense of humor is a little, teasing. You know that. I'm joking.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just messing with Codec too because I like making fun of him. But yeah, we're learning this together. So we're not going to know everything in that. And don't worry about I shouldn't have asked the question. You should, because that's an interesting thing that I'm sure you're not the only person to have asked that question.
Boom, right here, lossless. It is a technique where image size is reduced without any data loss. It only removes additional and non-essential data. It does remove something. It just
So I guess
turned into the SpongeBob argument again.
What?
Goodness gracious. This is the SpongeBob argument all over again.
What SpongeBob argument? What are you talking about?
Where it's like, no, I'm right. No, you're right.
No, I was just checking my actual picture because I was going to move on to this. Lossy versus lossless. Lossy is a technique where image data is lost from the original file. It is an irreversible process, which means once the data is lost, it cannot be regained. Let me click this picture. All right, it reduced file sizes, but sacrifices image quality. Image size reduction is significant. Sometimes about 60 to 70% of the file size can be reduced. Lossy image formats are JPEG or JPG and GIF. Oh yeah, GIF ruins stuff a lot. News websites, e-commerce
yeah.
websites mostly use lossy compression. Lossless, it's a technique where image size to reduce data is reduced without any data loss. It only removes additional and non-essential data. It is reversible. Image can be restored to its original state. It also produces reduced file size, but image quality remains the same. File size reduction isn't significant. Very low reduction in size. Lossless image formats are BMP, PNG, RAW, and etc. Mostly used on heavy images with transparent background photography. This is about photography, but it applies very well to film and stuff as well, because film is just a bunch of pictures on top of each other. We're not going to use these same formats, but lossy and lossless remain the same. Lossless does kick out some information. It just doesn't kick out any information that we're going to notice. It's not essential. It's just additional stuff. And it's not anything that's going to affect how good the image looks.
Okay, Coda is
Okay,
right.
I guess I am just going after your visual examples.
No, but it's
I
good.
can
It's good,
see.
it's good to be thorough because, like I said, I work well with visuals too. So, like, if he's not giving me specific, clear visuals, I can understand how one would be confused. So, fair enough.
Yeah, my bad, everybody.
Yeah, Coda, do better.
I'll try.
Thank you for arranging all this every week.
Yeah,
No, but Matt, we really do.
Real.
We do. Yeah, we really.
No,
do
I
appreciate your input.
I learn a bunch just from like talking about it too, by the way, everybody.
Yeah.
So like me talking about it and then hearing everyone else and then hearing disagreements or agreements, and then I'm looking into it more, learning new things. So yeah, I appreciate it.
And yeah, and we appreciate your feedback too, because you might be the only person that's like speaking up about it, but other people might be thinking it too, So never be afraid to like give an opinion or ask a question, because we tease, but you know that we always appreciate it.
All right.
Okay, now
I'm gonna skip that because we already talked about a lot of that. But some of the common codecs are H.264, also known as ABC. That's a lossy codec. H.265, also known as HEVC, which is also a lossy codec. And there's an older one called H.262 or MPEG-2 Part 2, which was a very lossy, and they got rid of that and replaced it with H.264. And then there's the ProRes, DNX HD, and DNX HR. ProRes, DNX, they are lossless. They are, well, it depends actually. It depends. ProRes has multiple ones that you can, it's like a family of different codecs, but for the most part, they are lossless. They are intra-frame, so they keep the information of each frame, making it easier to edit. When editing, a lot of people use ProRes or they DNX, or they make proxies, which we'll get into later at a different time. Proxies are just reduced quality files that you create that copy the originals so that they're easier to edit with. And then you tell the editor to bring in the high resolution images for the final output or export. And it saves a lot of computing power for your computer. So if you have a computer that doesn't process very well, you have an older model, or you have not the best processor in the world, creating something like a proxy, a lower resolution image or video, lower resolution clip, and then bringing that into your editor, and then editing with that will speed up the edit time and not have to have it buffer all the time and lag and all these other things that can be very frustrating when you're trying to get it done and you're trying to get it done very quickly. Excuse me.
I remember getting MPEG-4 and MP4 mixed up a lot when I was starting out, but seeing that like one is a container and the other is a codec.
Yeah, same. They actually made it a little bit easier now with some of the naming conventions that they have started using. But just always remember, if any of you guys are looking at the file itself, and it has the extension like MP4, AVI, MOV, MXF. Those are going to be the container. So that doesn't mean that's the quality at all. That just means that's the kind of container it is. It is in the kind of file extension it is.
You're going to need to take extra steps to try and figure out what the codec is.
Yeah.
Like you can put it into like VLC media player, and that can tell you.
Oh, another intra-frame codec is MJPEG, which is moving JPEG. And when I first heard it, because I've heard of JPEGs for pictures and how much quality gets lost from them, I thought that one's probably not used. And it turns out that MJPEG is actually used for whenever they're doing DCP, the digital cinema projection thing. The common codec to use is MJPEG, and they do it at the highest quality it can for theatrical release. So it is used quite often, but it's not used for home media. It's used for theatrical.
How do you spell that, Mel asked?
MJPEG. I'll just put it in there.
Right, but is it JPG?
No, it's JPEG.
JPEG.
Just don't. Just take the letters, please.
I asked you to spell it, and you're like JPEG.
What?
We're literally looking at M. Okay, sorry. I'm getting loud.
And you're like JPEG.
like JPGs we call them JPEGs, so it doesn't help.
No, you're right. JPEG. JPEG.
Okay.
Like you're like JPEG.
All right, so H.264 is a codec that is a common one that's used. It's starting to get taken over by H.265 because H.265 can reduce the file size even further without having a visual quality difference compared to H.264. But H.264 was used for like Blu-ray discs, it still is, Blu-ray discs, things like that. And it's used a lot for YouTube videos and other things. A lot of consumer cameras, they have, I'm pretty sure they're starting to shift over to H.265, but if you get any from the past few years, you're probably going to be shooting it on H.264. H.264 is one of those codecs that it can be all three of the different ones we've been talking about in one. It's the capture codec, you can edit in it, and you can export to it. So you can keep the codec the same all the way through your workflow. It is an interframe codec, which does mean that it does take more computing power to edit with. And so if you're editing a higher end thing that's not like a short video or something like that, if you're editing a feature film, you're definitely going to want to transcode the H.264 into something like ProRes or DNX while you edit, and then you can export it back out to H.264 if you're going to put the feature film somewhere on a website or YouTube or something like that. But yeah, H.264 is used a lot in a bunch of consumer cameras. H.265 is starting to take over now because it's newer and it compresses farther without reducing the quality. And so it's starting to take over a little more. It's designed
because it's so new. There are.
Okay.
I was just saying that because it's so new, there are still issues with compatibility, like because not everything has updated to keep up with it.
Got you. And that's another thing to consider when talking about codecs. It's like the editing softwares and things like that, even some of the newer ones, sometimes when it's a brand new codec, it only works in a specific editor for a while until the other ones start picking it up if the cameras start taking off in popularity or that codec is used a bunch.
Man, when the new M1 chips came out, I remember that everyone was complaining about that too, that like their editing softwares were glitching because they were still getting used to the format.
Yeah, so there are some formatting issues, especially with the newer codecs, and that is why you also want to keep in mind your workflow. They actually, a lot of people are recommending if you don't know if your computer can do it. If you have your editing system or you have an editor, just record something really quickly, make sure that it works from the camera to the editing to the export, and see if your workflow is going to work before you actually decide on which codec to use and what to do for the whole project, especially on a longer project like a TV show or a feature film that's going to take a bunch of time. You don't want to have a bunch of issues come up in the edit when it's not compatible with a lot of stuff and you have to use very specific things to make it work. You want to be able to know that that problem exists beforehand. So just checking out and testing the workflow before you begin is always recommended. They say H.265 is designed specifically for 4K video streaming and offers very efficient compression, giving high quality video with relatively the same file sizes as the H.264 was. Actually, it says it right here, what Mel just said. There are still some compatibility challenges with H.265, but at this point, most of the streaming video players will readily play it. It's perhaps the most efficient codec currently available, at least until H.266 becomes available, which is probably, a new recently announced one that hasn't come out yet.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I don't know what the right settings are, but I have experienced like glitchiness when trying to work with H.265 in Premiere.
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
H2, like. Mhm.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, just because they're saying compatibility is starting to be available doesn't mean that every single computer is going to be compatible. It probably just means like, oh, the main most updated ones or something like that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mel, what were you saying?
Oh no, I was just gonna say that like it's hard to keep up with like with the state of things, but like I've heard H.265 referred to as a bleeding edge format, which usually means like that it's like so new that it's more experimental, and it carries a higher degree of risk.
Yeah, because the compatibility isn't there yet, and there's not as much integration for all the different softwares. And there's also, I remember in old like Sony cameras back when they started coming out with their handy cams, they were starting to have issues with the way they were trying to do their codecs and their formatting, and you had to get a specific software to use it and all sorts of annoying stuff.
I would say that's
Like what-
another reason why you shouldn't always try to update to the latest everything, the latest software, the latest equipment, because compatibility is a huge thing, and if it comes out recently, that doesn't mean it's going to be compatible with everything right away. And that's something that we should definitely keep in mind if you need it for work and stuff like that.
I mean, it took a while for everyone to get DVD players that could play Blu-ray.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
All right. So when we're talking about ProRes or DNX, there's multiple ones. They're not just there's multiple versions of ProRes.
Of course,
So there's a higher quality one that uses more data but keeps more of the quality in it, and there's a very lower quality one, actually just for proxies, that kicks out more of the data but and has smaller file sizes, but allows you to edit in ProRes, so that it still flows better because it's still using intra-frame editing. It's just there's one that keeps all of the data and there's one that keeps a lot less. So ProRes 422 LT or ProRes Proxy are going to be the ones that are the smallest. They use the smallest amount of data. ProRes 4444XQ is the one that keeps the largest amount of data, which also means that if you're trying to get a project in that codec, it's going to be the largest size. So a proxy, Melsa, can you clarify what a proxy means? Proxy is a lower resolution file that's a copy of the one that you recorded. If I record something right now on my camera And let's say I had a camera that can record 12K and it can record RAW and all these other things. And I'm going to record that. But when I start to get it into editing, I have a iMac 2013. So I highly doubt that my computer is going to be able to handle it in the editing software because it has too much data. Editing software probably can't even handle 12K right now. Not sure exactly on that. But so what I would do if I were going to have 12K footage, and I wanted to keep it as high as I can, I would create what's called a proxy, which is a copy of the footage, and it's just a lower resolution version of it that is small enough for my computer to handle. It doesn't look as good, but it's just for editing, solely for editing, not anything else. I'm just going to edit with it. And because we talked about project files and the way that an editing software doesn't actually have the source video or the source audio in it, it just points to it and says, here's where I want to make the cuts on this clip. Here's what I want to do. And then when you press export, then it brings in that footage. And that's why rendering takes so long, because now it has to actually take the real footage, the source file, cut it up, chop it up, and put it all together into one single movie file that you have at the end. So if I create a proxy, that's for editing so that it works on my system. I can edit it around. I can tell it where I want it to clip at. It's going to be the same length. The duration is going to be the same as the high definition 12K footage that I have. It's just going to be able to allow me to work on it on my computer because my computer can't handle the high resolution version when I'm editing. So when I'm done editing, I just tell the computer, which we'll look into later when we get more into proxies, but because I'm not exactly sure the exact process on this, but basically you say to the editor, all right, now let's import the real files, the high resolution files, and export them. So you already did all your edits, you already did all your cuts, and the editing system software knows where you want to cut those, where you want to make those cuts, what kind of transitions are where, and all that stuff. And then it brings in the high resolution footage to actually start making those cuts and exporting it to one file for you to distribute somewhere. And ProRes makes one because they still want you to use intra-frame so that whenever you click on whenever you're editing, you can click on any frame at all, and it's not going to take the computer a second to load it because it's trying to figure out what that's supposed to look like. It'll just automatically know. You know, going back to this again, if you're editing on interframe footage, it's going to be like the bottom thing where it's only keeping track of the changes. You click on that middle frame, your computer has to go back to the first frame and then the second frame, the third frame, and the fourth frame to figure out what that fourth frame is supposed to look like. Instead of being on an intraframe codec where you just click on that middle one and it's there because it has all the information it needs. So that's why editing on interframe is very difficult for your computer because it's doing two things at once. It's trying to show you what that frame is going to look like without actually having all the information in that frame. So now it has to look back at a different frame to figure out what it needs to look like in the frame you clicked on. And that, unless you have a really good processor, that starts to buffer and lag and make your editing flow slow down because your computer is trying to figure all these things out at once, trying to show you it in real time, but it's like, it's doing a bunch of calculations to figure out what that frame looks like, which is why a lot of people will transcode it to ProRes or a proxy or a ProRes proxy, things like that. Another thing too, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I do know ProRes is made by Apple. So Final Cut typically tends to work better with it because Final Cut's for Mac only. And so ProRes is built in, like Mac, when Final Cut was being made, it's just like, that was a key codec they were thinking about, ProRes, because that's the Apple codec. When DNX, That's who makes DNX? Is it Avid? I think it's Avid that makes DNX. So that one works better with Avid Media Composer because they want to make sure that their specific codec works the best. Just like with DaVinci, it works really well with Blackmagic Raw because Blackmagic makes DaVinci. Mel's asking if I sounded choppy for anyone.
I don't think so, but then again, I'm in the same building, so.
Right.
But my internet does, for some reason, we have the same internet and it glitches on me sometimes, so.
All right, so yeah, like it doesn't mean that you can't use ProRes on Avid Media Composer or that you can't use it on Vegas Pro or something like that. It just means because it's made by Apple and because Final Cut is for Apple Mac, it's just that was their main codec that they had in their vision for it to work. So they made sure that one is formatted the most correctly to that software, pretty much. So that is something you might want to consider. I've heard some people say that when they tried to use ProRes on, a different media editor, a different nonlinear editing system, that it was like a little bit more laggy than if they use DNX or something like that. So depending on which software you're using, you might want to change which codec you're using. But for the most part, modern softwares can all read any of these codecs. They'll be able to, you can edit them in the system with any of these codecs. It just, one might work a little bit better or be a little speedier than the others. And when you're editing, you really want speed. Speed is a main factor. Even if it only takes 0.5 seconds for it to load, instead of taking 0 seconds for it to load, well, that's 0.5 seconds. That's going to keep adding up over time. And if you've ever edited, you know that you want to save as much time as possible because you don't want those little seconds, they start to add up after you've been editing the thing for 3 days or a week or a month. So you really want to save as much time as you can in those types of things. And that's why you want to try to make sure you get the best workflow, which is another reason you want to check out that workflow before you stick to it in the beginning. More recently, Apple ProRes and DNX, they were used more for just intermediary codecs. They were just used for editing mostly. Like you would record in whatever codec, and then you would transcode it to ProRes or DNX so that it works better in your editor. But recently, some cameras have started allowing you to record in ProRes. Some have allowed you, there's also these external recorders you can get that you can plug into your camera and it can record it in ProRes or DNX for you. It takes up a lot of data. But that is something that is possible now. Now people are doing that or they're shooting in RAW usually, especially with cinema, because you want to have more data, you want to have more control later in the edit. So they typically tend to put more money into the storage devices and things like that so that they can record at these high data rates that take up a lot of storage. But on the indie scene, it's depending on whatever the budget is, really, whether you're going to do that or not. But there are starting to be more cameras that are allowing it, more of the higher end cameras that are allowing you to shoot in ProRes or shoot in DNX. So that is also something that's starting to happen. Another thing I wanted to mention is H.264. This one. It is interframe, and that makes it lossy. But they also do have another version on that is intra-frame, which means it's a little bit less. It doesn't kick out as much data, and it has, it looks like this image on the top where it has image for each and every frame. It's called iframe H.264. Some cameras have it where it says H.264 with a little dash and says I, and that would mean that it's the intra-frame one. So if you have a camera that can record either or, you have to make the decision if you want to have it be intra-frame or interframe. Now you at least know what that means, what it does. Intra-frame is going to be easier for your edit. So if you have the storage space and you have enough memory cards, I would go for that. But if you don't have enough money to buy all that storage and buy all that memory cards, or if you don't have somewhere to keep offloading the data as you record, you're going to want to shoot it in interframe to get it as compact as possible before you start getting into the edit, and then you can transcode it to intraframe for editing. So I'm checking my notes to see if there's anything I haven't mentioned yet.
So could you say again what the intraframe version is called?
Yeah, for H.264, it's either going to be called iframe H.264, or it's going to be called H.264-I inside the camera, possibly. I can write it in the chat too if you need.
Thanks.
And that would be the intra-frame, which is going to be a larger file size, but a easier way to edit. It's either going to be that or H.264. When we're looking at formats, because they're both the extension and they're the codec, there's a different number of combinations. A lot of cameras, they don't even mention what the codec is really, they just tell you what the format is. And you might want to look up what codec and what wrapper or container that format means. So for instance, let's see. There's one called AVC HD. I know that's on Sony cameras, like the little camcorders. I know that because that was one of my first cameras. They shot an AVC HD. It uses an H.264 codec with an MTS or M2TS container. There's XAVCI, which is intraframe H.264 and an MXF container. On a lot of these cinema cameras out now and things like that, the higher grade cameras, the wrapper and the container, for some reason, a lot of them now are MXF. I don't really know the reasoning because I'm not really sure exactly what the containers do differently. I just know that that is what is starting to come out a lot now. There's also XAVCL, which is just the H.264 interframe, and it's MXF container. So if you had a camera that shoots either XAVCI or XAVCL, L means it's going to be the inner frame, the bottom one in this picture. And XAVCI means it's going to be intraframe, so the one on the top. So that one letter means the difference between if you're going to have the one on top that has more data and it's going to be a higher quality a bit, or the one that has a little bit more of a lossy data and a little bit lesser quality, but very smaller sizes. So that's something you need to figure out what your camera records. So the format XAVCL or XAVCI, that's what you're going to see on your camera. And you need to know what that format has, what's inside that format, because the format doesn't really tell you anything. I mean, XAVC, it could just say that. What does that mean? What codec is it using? Is it going to be the one that's going to take away more of the data and be smaller, or is it going to be the one that doesn't and is larger? That's the main thing you need to know when you're talking about quality and storage space. Many Canon cameras use what's called XFAVC, and it's H.264. It can either be intra or inter frame, and it's an MXF container. So again, you'd have to check and see, well, which one is intraframe, which one is interframe, or can my camera even do that? Because some cameras can't, but they'll still have the same, they'll still be called the same format, XF, AVC. And so you just got to check, well, what does that mean for this camera specifically? And other consumer cameras don't even list a format. They just have either H.264 or H.265, MP4 or MOV containers. That's very common. And then some cameras will just say ProRes for the format, but they're not telling you the exact codec from ProRes, like we saw here, where they are shooting at different data rates. So that is also something you'd have to look up. It shoots ProRes, well, which one? You know, that kind of stuff. They usually have an MOV container. And then again, some cameras just have DNX as their container. And that can be either DNX HD, which is high definition, or DNX HR, which is high resolution. The high resolution one is more for like the 4K video and things like that. So if you're trying to shoot 4K, you're going to need DNX HR. And so when it just lists DNX, you need to know what that means. And usually that'll be in an MXF container or an MOV container. So yeah, I would just say if you're looking up your individual camera, just see, you know, what format it uses. And if it doesn't list the codec, just look up the codec and see what that codec does. And if you are okay with it doing whatever it's going to do. When talking about delivery formats, YouTube recommends H.264 with a MP4 container. So when you have YouTube, when you go on your editing software, a lot of them will have a preset that just says YouTube, and you can click it and it'll put it into a H.264 MP4 container. And that's just what YouTube recommends that they use best with their website. Professional use delivery formats use ProRes or DNX HD or HR, Codecs in an MXF container. And then Panasonic has their own AVC Intra Codec in an MXF container. And Red cameras use their own called Red Code, which is their own codec as well. So all these different cameras can have their own. So don't think that they're just all the exact same, and just make sure you know what they're doing and you look them up. And then again, most cinema projects from like a DCP, digital cinema package, they use the MJPEG codec in an MXF container to show it at theaters. Other than that, I don't really think MJPEG is used really all that often. I think it's mainly just the theatrical release stuff, but that shows that that codec can be high quality. It just needs to be set up that way. And usually when you're trying to distribute your film, you'll hire a production house or whatever to do the DCP for you. You won't be setting it up yourself because they'll know exactly what it needs to be and how to get that the best quality it can be so that it can display in theaters without having any issues. Acquisition codec, that's another name for the camera codec that uses for capturing. So it's either capture codec or acquisition codec. Let's see, Dulu. And then of course, intermediary codec, that just means the one that you're transcoding to, like ProRes or DNX. I think, let me see, is there anything else? Transcoding is basically the same thing as using a proxy. You take the higher resolution files, convert them to a low resolution file for the edit, or it's used to get it into something that's easier to work with, like Apple ProRes or Avid DNX. That way they work better with your edit. But transcoding and proxies, they're kind of hand in hand with what they're used for. It's just to make it easier on editing. And then it's without affecting the original source files. Does anyone have any questions, comments, anything to add to anything with that stuff? Video codecs, transcoding.
I'm good.
It's very technical, and it is very, I don't know. I was having a hard time wrapping my head around it until I looked into it a little bit, but I do think I have a better understanding of how it works now. And, you know, it does make a huge difference in your final output of what you're trying to do and how good of quality you need to maintain. Like if you're trying to show it to theaters, you need to maintain as high of quality as you can as possible. So you want to know what the highest quality codec that you're able to afford with the storage you're able to do, with the workflow you're able to do. You want to be able to have the highest quality that you can with anything, really, not just with theater, but especially with theatrical release. You want to keep it as high as you can. What, Priscilla?
I didn't
You
say
go ahead,
anything.
say something.
No.
Okay. All right. Moving on from that, more technical stuff.
Yay.
Backing up your footage and audio, backing up your project. This is stuff that you need to do. This is going to go hand in hand with DIT and Data Wrangler when we start talking about them in just a second. But this footage that you're shooting, you don't want to lose it. You don't want to shoot for the day and then you bring your memory card home and you try to put it in your computer, and then your memory card is having an error. And or even worse, you're shooting on your camera, you have two memory cards, you fill up one, you take it out, and you fill up the other one, you take it out, you forget that the other one's full, you put it in your camera, you reformat it, and it deletes all that footage from that memory card. That is stuff you want to make sure to never do, because you'll lose all your footage for the day. There are some systems where you can recover it, but it's very difficult to actually get it to be recoverable. Usually you just lose all that footage, you lose all your data. And it's a big hassle, because if you shot your whole day on one card and then you forget to offload it, or you accidentally reformat it at the end of the day, well, now that entire day's work is gone. So this is where backing up your footage comes in. And this can happen on set depending on how long you're shooting for. If you're shooting a feature film over multiple weeks or just multiple days, you should be offloading your footage every day and copying it and backing it up. If you are shooting for just one day, you will be backing it up either at the end of the day or the start of the next day. But either way, you always want to make sure you're backing it up, copying it to multiple hard drives so that you're not losing it in case one of those hard drives messes up or gets lost or gets stolen or breaks. Well, you have another one that's going to work and has all your footage on it.
If you're not doing that, you deserve whatever cruel, horrible fate happens to you.
When we delve a little deeper into hard drives and SSDs and storage later this semester, we're going to talk more about like RAID systems and things like that. But for now, we're just going to talk about backup onto multiple storage devices and archival. So first of all, when you're backing up, you want to back up onto 2 hard drives. Oh, this thing's not really what I want. Here we go. First thing is, when you're shooting, you want to back it up onto 2 hard drives. Again, this is for redundancy. If one fails, if one breaks, you have another one that has all the information on it. So you take whatever memory card that was in your camera, whether it was a CFast card or a compact flash or an SD card, whatever you're using, you You put that into the computer and you plug in your hard drive to the computer and you transfer over the information. Then you unplug that hard drive and you plug in the second hard drive to do the same thing. You don't want to copy, they say not to copy the data from hard drive A to hard drive B. Instead, copy it from the memory card to hard drive A, and then go back and copy it from the memory card to hard drive B. Why? Because if something messes up in hard drive A, then it's going to be messed up when you copy it to hard drive B, and you're not going to notice it until you get into editing, or until somebody finds it later on. And that's when you probably reformatted your card to empty it out of all the data so you could use it on set again. So instead of doing that, instead of there maybe being an error in hard drive A, you just make sure you're copying everything from the memory card over. There still could be an error, but that would mean that it is from the memory card itself, which would suck. But it still has the less things you try to copy over, the less chances there are for there to be an error like that. So first step, copy it over to hard drive A, copy it over to hard drive B. Next thing is, if you are traveling, you do not want to keep both hard drives with you in the same bag. You could have your bag stolen, or you could lose it. Or, you could accidentally drop your bag and then it hits concrete or something. Whatever happens, you don't want both. There's no reason to have two hard drives if you're going to store them in the same place where they can both get stolen, ruined, or lost. So you want to have them in separate bags if you're traveling. That way, if one gets lost, stolen, or broken, you have the other one in the other bag and you didn't lose that whole day or week of footage. There's also some cameras that allow you to record to two cards at once. So that can be good if you want to immediately back up your data. It's just going to take up more space, especially if you're shooting 4K and you're shooting RAW. You're going to need a lot of memory cards if you're trying to shoot it onto two cards at once. But it is a good way to immediately back up the data in case one of those memory cards is faulty or has an error or something's wrong with it. That way, when you copy over the information to the hard drive, there's no issue. If there's issues with card A, card B has the exact same information that you can copy to the hard drive. And then you'll have your footage. If you do that, if you do shoot onto two cards at once, then you want to use card A and transfer the footage to hard drive A. And you want to get card B and transfer it over to hard drive B. For the same reason, in case one of them are messed up, you have it on one of those hard drives and you have the information you need. So a lot of this is just like, backing it up, redundancy to make sure that you're not losing this stuff. The higher up you get, the more it's going to be copied. It might be 2, it might be 4 hard drives that it gets copied on. It might be more. They might copy it onto a hard drive and immediately take it off site just in case the whole place catches on fire. Depending on how much money you're spending on this thing, you want to make sure that whatever you're capturing is not going to be lost, not going to be ruined. And so they take extra precautions. The higher up you get, the more redundancy, the more copying they do, and the more paranoid it seems like they are because they're trying to do these things just to make sure nothing happens to this stuff. So another thing you want to do is when you have the main drive and you have your backup drive, your hard drives, you want to actually physically store them in 2 different locations. Now, if you're going to just store them in your house, then store them on 2 separate sides of the house. Again, just in case you have a robbery, there's a fire, there's an earthquake, whatever happens, it's less likely that that both hard drives will be ruined at the same time. If there's a fire that comes from your room, that one hard drive in your room might be ruined, but the one that you left on the other side of the house in the basement, that one's still good. So then you still didn't lose all of your stuff. You might have lost your day's work that you were working on your computer, but you didn't lose all the footage. So they say to physically store them in 2 separate spots. You can even store one of the backups into like a fireproof safe for extra protection, and or for archival once you're done with the master and you're copying over that. Then you can store it somewhere where it's going to stay safe for as long as possible. And then additionally, you can also store it on cloud storage like Google Drive or what's that other one called? Dropbox, Vimeo. Some of those places have different subscriptions where you can subscribe to it to get unlimited data, unlimited storage space, so that you can upload your final master onto the cloud as well. That way you don't lose it when you're done. They say that step, that should be when you're actually done editing it, when you've got your master, you've had all your music and everything for it. And it's basically like when they used to put things in the film onto film stock and they would hide one of the film stock somewhere offsite. It's kind of the same thing as that. Once you're completely done, you want to upload your final version to the cloud. That way, if you have the money and you have the ability to afford one of those subscriptions, that way it's always going to be somewhere, and that's going to be offsite, so that if your entire house explodes from a missile, you still have the footage far away on in the cloud somewhere.
Talking about apocalyptic scenarios now.
That's how they treat it, because it's kind of like it's a piece of art, and you want to treat it like it's a piece of art. It's a video, it's moving pictures, but it is a piece of art, and you want to be able to preserve it.
And the world might end, but at least you have your footage.
As best you can. There's also workflows where people will have 2 different hard drives in their computer, where they also have one's just for time machine that backs up everything that was changed each day. So while they're working, they have the backup constantly there. So if one of their hard drives stops working, they still have all of their changes in their data from the day before. There's a bunch of different redundancy situations like that, where you can keep copying it to different things until you're completely done with it. And then you copy it again to store it offsite, to archive it, and then again to the cloud so that you store it offsite on a different server. And there's all these different ways of trying to maintain the footage and make sure it doesn't get lost, because these things can start messing up. If you don't back it up from the very beginning, then like I said, the memory card could be messed up. So for a redundancy, just in case situation, some cameras you'll record to 2 memory cards at once. The likelihood of that memory card messing up while you're transferring it to the first hard drive, it's very low. So a lot of times people don't even consider that, don't care. But then you also have the 2 hard drives in case one of those messes up, or something when it was transferring over messes up. Well, now you have it on another hard drive. And then physical location, you switch them just in case, and then you do the server and you put it to an offsite place and you put it in another side of your house, and physical locations separate. And then, all these things are just to make sure that if anything happens, if the worst case scenario happens, you still have access to the footage. Even if it sets you back a week of editing work, it's still better than just losing out the entire project at once, especially with the more money that you've been spending on it. If you spent $100,000 on a production, you don't want to have the worst case scenario happen where you lose all of that work and now you have nothing to show for it because it's all just gone. What?
We get it.
Exactly. Well, this is just like, it's pretty much like that's what this is. Let's see. Another person said when they're getting ready to edit, they add one additional backup hard drive. That way they have one that they're working on and the other two are just backups. And then when they're done, they delete all the information off of the third one so that they can start their next project. Your workflow will also depend on how often you're shooting videos or movies or how much work you're doing in this kind of stuff. But if you're just doing one project every so often here and there, I would say 2 hard drives and separate locations is good enough. But if you're constantly working on new things, if you're working for someone else and they're constantly making new content, then you want to just be sure that you're not losing any of their content and you're keeping track of it. And once it's done editing, you make sure that you don't accidentally delete it when you get the next project in.
Got it.
Another thing they said is make sure when you are getting ready to edit that you're not editing off of your memory card. Make sure to transfer and copy the files over to your computer first, organize and rename them, and then edit them from your computer. So if you move that memory card, you take it somewhere else, your editing system software is not going to be able to find and locate the files, and then you're not going to be able to edit it anymore. And if you accidentally reformatted that memory card and you were editing off of it and you didn't complete the edit, then you just lost all that work and the footage. So that is something you want to make sure you transfer it over to your computer. And then, the master version of what's called the master is like the highest quality that you need or that you can get of your project. And that from that master, that's where you separate it into separate projects. But that's the thing that you're going to copy over and keep on a different hard drive and archive is the master version, the highest quality version that you can get. And that's the one that you're going to keep on multiple hard drives at the end. That way, if you need to make a DVD, Blu-ray, you're going to put it on a website or a streaming service, you just take that master file and you re-export it again and again to the different, for the different uses. So then you would use different codecs for it and everything like that. Another thing is in editing software, like I know Premiere has this, I think Final Cut has it. I'm not sure about the others, but I'm pretty sure they all have it. They have something called, they have the ability to do what's called consolidate. Consolidate the media, which will copy every edit, every clip, every visual effect, sound effect, all of that's in the project. And it'll transfer it to a new media, or so then you can use it to transfer to a new media editor, or so you can back up your entire edit from up to that point. So consolidating media will save every single thing you've done in the editing software and the footage and everything in wherever the destination you tell it to go. And that's a good way to also keep that. Like if you don't want to just keep your master, some people will do that. They'll copy everything and the final edit. That way they have access to everything if they need to change anything around later. If they need to add any scenes in or make a different version or an extended version, they can go exactly where they stopped editing when they thought they were completely finished and add in scenes or change it around after they're completely done. And then some people will keep both a master and that consolidated final edit together on one hard drive. Some people will separate it into 2 hard drives. Depends on how safe you want to be with it. But there's all those options as well. And then lastly, a more expensive but a longer term option for backing up stuff is what's called LTO tape or even film. Film has been started to be used again to.
Okay, now you're cutting off a little bit. It's getting a little choppy.
Oh, I am?
On my end anyway.
Let me repeat that then. A more expensive but longer term option for backing up things is what's called LTO tape or even film. Higher end productions have started archiving their new films back onto film, going from digital back to film, just because film can be held for long periods of time. It doesn't degrade in the right conditions and things like that. So it's pretty safe to keep it at the highest quality it can be. And all it needs is light, you know, something to show through it to show what the image would be. So that is being an option that's being used recently, which is actually kind of interesting since we went away from film to digital, but now we're going digital back to film just to keep it for long term. But those, of course, are way more expensive. So for an independent production with a lower budget, you're probably not going to use either one of those and just put it on a hard drive and put it somewhere safe. Does anyone have any questions, comments?
I'm good.
Oh, so this is kind of what I was talking about. The camera goes to the computer, going to two different SSDs, as well as different two different hard drives, going to a server, and then getting backed up offsite somewhere else. And then you can see like that. Backup workflow goes from the memory card, two separate copies, going to two separate locations, and then a third offsite location. All right. So if you're on a set that's a little bit larger, you won't be doing that stuff yourself. You're not going to be, unless your role is specifically that, which could either be a Data Wrangler or a DIT, which is a digital imaging technician. Unless you have those specific roles on a larger set, those people are going to be the ones that are offloading the footage, the dailies it's called. Each day they offload the footage onto these computers and these separate hard drives to make sure that it's all copied, it all transferred correctly. And then they give the approval for you to go reformat the memory cards. And if they made a mistake, it falls on them. One of the functions of the DIT is to apply a LUT or a light color grade to the feed that goes from the camera to Video Village. So when you're shooting in like log or raw, you'll see that the footage looks very unsaturated and very washed out and pretty ugly. And when the people in Video Village, like the producer and the script supervisor, maybe the DP, the director, they want to see what it might look like in the final image. So the DIT, his other role is to make like a LUT or a light color grade on the image to make it look kind of like how it might look when it's being edited, when it has that actual color grade. That way they're kind of seeing it and making decisions based on the final output or something close to it, rather than on that washed out, desaturated looking image. They also send out multiple feeds to different sources. So there's like, on larger sets, somebody might want an ungraded clean feed where they're seeing exactly what's being shot from the camera. And so they can receive, the DIT will set it up to where they receive the ungraded clean feed while the other people receive the graded one. The DIT also interacts with the camera operator and the director of photography a lot, making sure that the menus are configured correctly and all that sort of stuff for the camera itself. The DIT's other role is the on-set media management that we were just talking about for backing up data, ensuring that none of the media gets lost and it all gets transferred and backed up correctly. And that ensuring that all the data was transferred over by checking the size that was in the card and the size that is now on the hard drive to ensure they're the same, which means that all the data was copied over. They also verify and validate that the footage or audio has been copied over. And they'll also give a basic naming convention to the files so everything is organized. They might not name it per se, but they will name different folders that they'll put the files in. So it might be like day 1, day 2, day 3. Or actually, it's probably more like camera, audio. And then you go into camera folder and it says like day 1, day 2, day 3. And then you go into day 1 and they might even have like what card it came from, card 1, card 2. That way they're keeping track of all the different footage and they just import it to those different locations so that it's very clear what footage is being imported. So when it goes to the editing team, the assistant editor, they can start renaming it and organizing it in the way that the editing team wants to use it. And they understand what that footage is. It's the camera's footage, camera 1, from day 1, from, memory card 3. Okay, great. So that's the DIT. The DIT is like the bridge between the camera, and the camera department, the production department, sound and camera, and the post-production department, because they're going to be setting up that workflow. They're going to initiate that workflow to figure out how to, that kind of stuff, the folders and all of that. They're gonna initiate it and make sure everybody agrees to it. That we are going to do camera, audio, day 1, day 2. And it's going to be, the naming conventions are going to be like that. Is that okay with everybody? Is the organization good? Okay. And then they start doing it like what was agreed upon. The DIT's other job is also to ensure everything is compatible with each other, like using a camera with this kind of cable and that kind of monitor, making sure that all is going to work fine. And they ensure there's not any issues and stuff. And if there are issues that arise during production, all of a sudden the monitor, it starts malfunctioning and it doesn't show what the true image is, then the DIT will be the one to figure it out to get it running and looking good again for whatever production crew member was needing it. They also, they set the aspect ratio and other things to make it look as similar as possible to the final output. So another thing you choose when you are shooting a film is what the aspect ratio is going to look like in the end. And so they'll set the monitors to look like that aspect ratio so that everyone can see not just what the camera sees, but what the aspect ratio is going to be when they either like punch in, since the camera is actually recording more than they need for whatever aspect ratio they choose most of the time. The other thing a DIT will do is help a camera assistant by evaluating the focus. And what does that say? Oh, watch and make sure there's no boom shadows or any unwanted reflections and that kind of stuff. And if they see anything, they'll communicate it to the DP or the camera operator that, hey, this thing needs to change or this thing needs to be different, because they want to make sure that the image looks the best. They want to make sure that, the camera assistant got the focusing right. So they'll help them when they can, trying to make sure that everything is going to look the way that the DP is wanting it to look, that the director is wanting it to look. And so they'll be kind of there. They're more like the technical person to kind of help out with that kind of stuff in case the other people who are doing these things aren't the most tech savvy. They might be, they might know a lot about cameras and they might know a lot about how to pull focus and things like that. But cameras, especially, the more advanced they're getting and the more that they keep coming out with new features and new techniques and things, they have a lot of these little technical aspects to them, which the DIT is usually the one to know, so that they can ensure that whatever the DP needs or whatever the camera operator needs or director needs, they are the one to go in and technically change it to get it all to work technically for everybody, for the monitoring it and viewing what the camera is recording or what is on the camera, like the menus and the features on the camera itself. They're the ones that go and look at it and say, hey, I'm seeing on my monitor that, maybe your ISO needs to go down a bit. If the camera operator or the DP didn't notice, then they're the ones to really show them that. Because when you're shooting in log, when you're shooting in raw, sometimes the exposure levels are harder to tell. So the camera operator might not be able to notice on his camera that the exposure needs to be set down or up a little bit. But when the DIT changes the image and adds a color grade that matches what the director of photography was wanting, and displays it on a monitor, they'll be able to notice some of those things that the camera operator might not be able to, and they'll be able to go and communicate that to the DP and the camera operator that, hey, from what we're seeing over here, what you guys told me how you want the image to look, we're seeing it is overexposed right now, or we're seeing it underexposed right now. And then the DP will go look at it, check it out, see if they want to change anything around and approve of any changes to the camera, to the settings in the camera. Does anyone have any questions or comments about a DIT?
No.
You sound tired, honey.
Yeah.
All right, so on a larger set, even larger than that, so when the DIT, they have all those different job roles, those job functions. You also have what's called a data wrangler or data wrangler, I don't know, however you want to pronounce it. And a DIT can do the data wrangler's job, but a data wrangler cannot do the DIT's job. If the data wrangler is doing the DIT's job, then they shouldn't be called a data wrangler. They should be called a DIT because it's a more involved job function. Data wrangling is just doing the data wrangling. It's just grabbing the data or receiving the data and putting it onto those separate hard drives and making sure it all functions correctly, doing the folders and all that stuff. They usually have what's called a checksum software that verifies there's no changes or alterations during transfers of footage, because depending on what kind of devices you have and what kind of hardware you have, for some reason things don't transfer exactly as you might think, and it might make a slight alteration here or there. So they have this automatic software that basically says, hey, nothing changed, you're all good to go, green check mark, whatever. And that way they quickly can go ahead and move on to the next one, especially for any kind of shows that, like if you're using a TV show, they usually have a bunch of cameras, multicam setups. And so they're usually the ones that need a data wrangler and a DIT, especially because the data wrangler is probably going to be receiving cards from a bunch of different crew members over and over and over again, all throughout the day. And they just need to keep ensuring that everything's good to go. If a DIT was the only one on set and they had that much data to copy and transfer over, then they might be sitting at that little workstation the whole day and they're not able to do their other job functions. So if those job functions are really needed, then the production should hire a second person to handle that side of the job, which is the data wrangling part, while the DIT stands next to the camera or the DP and helps out however they can with all of that stuff. Another thing a data wrangler should do, or you, if you're the one copying and moving around footage and things like that, is you should use like tape or labels to keep track of each memory card. Make sure that you keep track of if they've been copied yet and if they're completed. Be sure each memory card is done being used. Those things, because you never want to send a card back to the camera operator or the camera assistant or whoever for them to reformat the card, because they're going to believe that you're done transferring the footage. So a data wrangler has to be sure no one touches their station, because they need to be sure that whenever they have those different labels and those different things, they check, double check, and triple check that the footage did carry over, that they did copy the stuff off of that card, and that memory card is good to go and be reformatted. You know, because it goes back to that whole thing. You don't want to lose the data. And if they're the ones that send the card back and it turns out that they didn't copy the data, well, that falls on them, and they, you know, they could be fired depending on the production. So they have to like keep track of it and be sure everything's good to go and stay organized with it. On some sets, data wranglers might be going to the camera and the sound people and actually bringing the cards back to their station. And on other ones, the crew might be bringing the camera assistant or the sound assistant or someone like that might be bringing the data, the memory cards to them. Or, you know, it could be a mix of both. It just depends on the production set, and it also depends on how busy and how much footage and audio that's being recorded and how many memory cards need to be exchanged throughout the day. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So the data wrangler is pretty much, if you don't have one of those, the DIT is going to take over and do that job function. If you don't have a DIT or a data wrangler, you're going to have somebody do this stuff. You might have a camera assistant do it, but you just got to be sure whoever's doing it, or if you're doing it, they have to be extra careful and extra good at organizing and keeping track of things, because if they mess up even once, that's that whole memory card gone. So whoever does this job function, you just need to be sure that they are reliable and that they know how to do it and that they are paying attention every single time, because it's probably a boring job, let's be real, but you still got to pay attention to it to make sure that, you know, you're not messing anything up, because that's a huge mistake if it happens. Anybody have any questions, comments, or things to add?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Mel. No problem.
Night, Mel. Good night.
All right, guys, last thing I'm going to talk about today is metadata. Metadata, it's information about the clips. It's usually added by the assistant editors, sometimes the editors themselves, and that gives specific data to each piece of media. That allows the media to be easily searchable later on if looking for a specific thing. Many editing softwares also allow you to add metadata to either the file for the project file. I think I have this. Oh, no, I don't. Whoops, I exited out of my thing. Premiere Pro metadata. Which one did I use? Is that, or is this one? Ah, this one. All right, so a lot of, I know this is Premiere, but a lot of the editing softwares do the same thing, where they can add metadata to the file, and they can either add it to, like in this, if you see it up here, it says clip, and right here it says file. If you were to add metadata to the file, that's actually adding it to the source file that's on your computer. And if you're adding it to the clip, then you're just adding it to the file inside the Premiere Pro project. So you're not actually affecting the source file itself with the metadata. You're just affecting inside this project. So you can choose either one, and you can just add a bunch of different types of metadata. There's all sorts of things you can add to it. It's basically just stuff that you might want to have to look up later on. That you need to know, that you need to see how many of these pieces of footage were recorded by this person. Like in this GIF right here, he's putting in a guy's name. And since he went into these separate clips and he added who recorded it, if he needed to search that later and see all the clips recorded by that guy, then he just searches that guy's name, and now these 3 clips show up and they're the ones that guy recorded. So things like that. Cameras allow you to also internally change some of the basic metadata, like which camera it's being used. If it's a camera A, camera B, camera 1, camera 2. whatever your naming convention is. They also allow you to change the take, the scene, interior, exterior. It's basically all the information you would see on a slate, but it's internally attached to each clip. So depending on your production and your workflow, you might decide to go into your camera and actually adjust it. And a lot of cameras, if you change the take and things like that, it'll each time you stop recording and start recording again, it'll automatically change the take for you. These are usually on the higher end cameras that are made specifically for filmmaking and things like that. But I'm sure some of the higher end DSLRs and things like that will start coming out with functions like this in the future if they don't already have them. But it's just a way to like keep very good track of everything. There's what's called metadata schemas, which is just a collection of different metadata properties for specific uses. For instance, there's dynamic media schema, which includes properties like scene and shot location, mainly used for like filmmaking stuff. If you look on this image right here, it says Dublin Core. That's its own schema that has all of these different properties like contributor, coverage, author, date, and all those other ones listed. And all it basically means is it's just for different properties of information that you can add to it. You can even create your own and you can add whatever you want to it. So if it doesn't have something that you want, if it doesn't have the specific information you're looking for, then you might just create your own. So you could use this in a lot of different instances. One, you can maybe use it for, you could say what kind of lens was used on the shot. And then you could have a separate metadata property about what the location it was shot in. And then later on, if you're returning to that location in a different scene, or if you're returning to that location and you want to make sure you're using the same lenses, you can just look up that information. All those clips will pop up and you'll see what lens type was used and what location was used. And so you can see if it's like same or if you need to change something or whatever. It's just an easier way to search for everything at once. A lot of the times you're going to have to add this metadata in, like when you are either in the camera, like I said, for some of the basic stuff, or right when you put it to the computer, you want to add it in. That way it's easily searchable, but you also just want to do it for stuff you might actually use. There's no point in filling out every single line of data that you're not going to need. You might not care what the copyright notice is. There might not even be one. So you don't even need to put something there. That's, a lot of these things are also used if you're working on multiple projects all the time. You want to make sure to keep all of them separate. Metadata is a good way to separate them. Another reason this stuff is used a lot is if you're using multiple editors for the same project, having everything have a lot of information is always better. Like you have this description field, and you can see metadata in a clip and it'll tell you what the duration is, what the size, the resolution is, those kinds of things. But it's not going to tell you if it's a medium shot. It's not going to tell you if it's in a location that, if it's in a scene 2 with character B, that kind of stuff you might want to put in the description field so that it's very easy to understand what that clip is. So if you're sending it off to another editor, they can look at each file and see exactly what each one is and what's in it. So they're not using, they don't have to like look through every single clip. And yeah, so like that's all this stuff is for. Some of the metadata you might want to add to your own clips is like either the f-stop or the t-stop that was used, the frames per second, the ISO, white balance, where the white balance was, if there was any tint to the image, what the shutter speed was, the lens type and the focal length, the location it was in, whether it was interior or exterior, day or night, what kind of filters were used, if any, on the lenses, like an ND filter or something like that. You might want to add the name of the camera operator, what the shot size was, what characters are in the shot, and things like that. There's a bunch of other stuff you might want to add, but that's some general stuff that you might want to add as a filmmaker. And like I said, either that can be used for helping other people to understand what's in this clip, or for you later to see if you need to, at the end of your edit, you're seeing that you need a different take. You only shot 3 takes of this same scene with this one character, and you're seeing if maybe some of the other footage could be used of that character so that it looks like it's coming from the same place, and you're using it in place because you don't have any footage that works from the 3 takes. You don't want to have to do another pickup if you don't have to. And so if you have the metadata that says the character's name, let's say if it's Jason, you can just type in Jason and it'll pull up all those clips that have Jason in it. And you can look through those very easily to see, do any of these work? Do any of these look similar to what I'm trying to go for to make it look like I could cut to him? And then does that scene work because of that? That way you don't have to look through every single clip that you have and watch it from beginning to end, because you already know which ones have him in it and which ones don't. So that's just one example of like why you would want or need metadata. And there's plenty of other uses, especially depending on what you're trying to do. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything to add for metadata? All right. Anyway, this is like one of those things where you're probably not going to really notice that you would like it until you need it. And then from then on, you'll probably use it to make sure that you have it for the next time. But, you know, if you do have it and you need it, you'll see that it quickly, you'll see that it came in super, it came in handy very much so. So just keep that stuff in mind. The last thing I'm going to say is just next Monday, we are going to be talking about sound editing tools and what they do. And we're actually going to be making a exercise out of that, where we are going to take an audio clip and we are going to adjust it with these different audio tools to see exactly how it changes. Each one of us can do it on our own. And we'll probably show one that we did where we just take the same clip and adjust the EQ, the compressing, the panning, reverb, and all these other tools that you can use for the main ones, the main audio tools you can use to change the way the audio sounds. So we can see what effect it has on the audio and what it changes, and how different it sounds when using these tools. And you can get creative and use them how you want. You don't just have to like raise the distortion and then lower it. You can raise it here, lower it there, raise it there, and make it sound very different, and just get creative with it. We'll talk more about this on Monday when we go over this stuff, but yeah, you can just be like really creative with it and try to figure out how you want to do it. And then we're also talking about editing again, but we're going to get into a little bit less of the technical stuff and a little bit more of the theory of like how to edit the film with L cuts, J cuts, hard cuts, and other cuts, other types of cuts. And we'll delve a little deeper into what L cuts and J cuts are. We already kind of went over that, but we'll just look into it a little deeper to see when it's used, why, where, and what kind of effect it can have emotionally speaking and things like that. And we're also going to be talking about film grants and film fellowships, what the differences are, and you know, some pros and cons, and maybe how to apply to grants and things like that. So that's everything, everybody. Thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording there.